Bring our tea and coffee back to our tables. We can start the next session about a minute late. Shocking stuff. Shocking stuff. If there are any Swiss on the call, I apologize. Or Germans. If there are any Sri Lankans on the call, I also apologize for starting on time. Thanks very much. At least for me, I have all these neurons firing when I hear certain leitmotifs of the conversations because I know what the day holds and what the day was designed to hold. So from the first interaction with Paul to the second session with Elena and Clark to this session with Thomas and David, I think that you'll see also as participants and also people joining us on Zoom that there are leitmotifs, commonalities, key ideas, key issues that bind the conversation today and all the sessions together. So it is my great pleasure to have on stage here in Dunedin David Hood from Otago and Thomas Beagle, not from Otago, but in Otago. So as has always been the case, I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. May I say that, David, I've been following your Twitter and your work for a very long time, secretly from the shadows on Twitter, and I find it absolutely fascinating. And I think that the audience will as well in Aotearoa, New Zealand, because it riffs off the work that NC PAX has been doing, but also gives a real perspective into the country through this one platform. So a huge fan of your work. And Thomas, I think you're going to speak to something that is very close to my heart and many others in terms of civil liberties and these issues about rights perspectives that we also often only talk about parenthetically. So with that, David, you're going to take the floor and followed by Thomas, 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up. Thank you.
So, I am not an academic, I am not government, I am not an NGO, I don't have a startup. I am a member of civil society who in 2016 thought there's clear electoral influence campaigns going on over social media overseas. Somebody should be keeping an eye on this for New Zealand, and I happen to have the technical data analysis skills to do so. And that's my genesis into this entire area. So I've been monitoring New Zealand social media. And by social media, I mean Twitter, because it's easy to ethically monitor, and there are certain things around the openness and diffusion of topics compared to closed groups. But the first issue is, what is New Zealand? New Zealand is a physical place. New Zealand is a cultural place. And there is a whole emancipatory idea that people in a region have the right to speak about that region. But anyone in New Zealand is well aware that over the past year, New Zealand frequently gets used as a rhetorical example from other places in discussions that bears only a peripheral resemblance to New Zealand. So we've got physical and cultural. And if we were looking at physical, overshot slightly. If we were looking at, there we go. If we were looking at physical, we could be looking at the very small set of accounts that actually have location data. But equally well, you can do things like look at the aggregate of the time zones that a particular account is posting in. So the top example there is someone in New Zealand who is posting between 7 a.m. and 11 p.m. on the regular. The second one down is someone who immigrated from the UK to New Zealand, and there is a clear physical shift in that. And the third one down is a New Zealand fringe right-wing account that claimed to have gone to Washington, DC to participate in the pro-Trump protests. Computer says no. But that does raise certain issues about authenticity of claims and what is claimed. I want to talk about the largely failed attempt of some alt-right figures in 2018 to come and speak in New Zealand, where you could look at the people directly replying to those figures, and some people were directly replying and liking them, and some people were directly replying and not liking them or anyone who liked them. And then you could take all those figures and look at who were they liking, and you build up poles of cultural influence, and you get a spectrum in between, from, in this case, left to alt-right. And yeah, and one thing, New Zealand is pretty strongly anti-alt-right on those graphs compared to the other countries based on physical location in that graph. But also, what doesn't show up on this graph, and a reason it's a weak graph, is that for all the countries, the main poles of opposition were centred around people reading what I'm going to describe in the interest of time as civil society nerds. The people who are quite happy to write long threads about the historical context of events. In New Zealand, there was that group as a pole of opposition, but there was also Māori from across the political spectrum. And that is very unusual in international Twitter, that an Indigenous population has the cut-through to actually be read by the majoritarian platform. So that's a characteristic feature of New Zealand Twitter. But as well as cultural versus physical, there is also cultural and physical. And I want to spend a moment talking about an example where New Zealand Family Planning posted a tweet that was, "Our services are available to everyone, including trans people." And a whole lot of people from the UK took offence at this and wanted to make their opinions very well known. This is the big danger for New Zealand, is that we get these surges from offshore that cannot be clearly identified as being from offshore, and it gives a distorted opinion if you were measuring New Zealand's feelings about things on the basis of this opinion. However, what also happened after we had this wave of unusually timed posts with unusual language is that there was an organic response from people in New Zealand to go in and tag these replies with the country of origin by people going in and looking up the biographies of the people involved. And that is an organic, stochastic, civil society defence of institutions against bigotry. And that is something to think about in terms of where you're trying to build capacity. For this, I did a very carefully constructed geographic survey of Twitter where I was matching New Zealand to cities and towns in other countries. New South Wales and Queensland for Australia, Colorado for the US. Because it was population matched, it misses London and Sydney. They're too big to compare to New Zealand. The big thing is Australia retweet a huge amount. I'm not an Australian expert, I don't know about why. New Zealand replies a whole lot. New Zealand's reply so much, and not just negatively, that it freaks out people overseas when they encounter New Zealanders in conversation with them. Why are you talking this up? But New Zealand want to talk things up here. Where it gets really interesting is I'm picking out the amount of people's timelines that is replies to followers, because this is the high inclusion area. This is the area with the most fertile ground for common understanding, because this is people whom you are interested in enough to follow, engaging with things that you have written. And New Zealand is off the scale in terms of if you try and work out how much randomness would be involved in getting to places like Australia and the US and things like that. Qualitatively, there's the same kind of things showing up. There's New Zealand Secret Santa, a literal gift exchange network with the anonymous network. There is Bird of the Year, a mixture of memes and science communication, whimsy and adding context. There is using Twitter as a lost property office, which not only has the assumption that the physical world is connected enough with Twitter that people will see your lost property, it also has the assumption that people will be helpful enough to return it when they do see it. So these are all characteristic features, and they show up in other ways. New Zealand political parties' use of data and evidence in communications on Twitter compared to political parties of other countries. Most of this comes from the fact that New Zealand political parties assume that you will do the reading and link to things. But that's a huge difference. And I would suggest that for political people listening to this, you may not want to listen too heavily to advice on how to do campaigns from other countries. If you look at heavily politically involved individuals who have liked at least one person from a political party's tweets, most of them have liked people from multiple political parties. This is not polarization. This is enthusiasm, because they're liking multiple parties. Yes, they like one party a lot, but they are liking other people as well. So, with all of this good stuff happening, you can focus in very finely on the negative stuff because it is not swamped by systematic things. And if you look at the new accounts with less than 10 tweets, there are a bunch in there that are deleting so many tweets that when I looked over the course of a year, I had 900% of the tweets that the account was supposed to have because they were deleting tweets to politicians. That sort of singles out a trolling area for immediate response. Similarly, if you look at the language in a tweet and you run it through a synonym dictionary and you stem it to chop off the endings, and then you look at 100,000 replies plus to tweets, you can see a hill of common dialogue of about 20% similar content. But down at 0, you can see the peak of non sequiturs, which is the yeah, nah kind of meaningless agreement or disagreement, but that's also the zone at which abuse, non sequitur abuse, crops up in. So there are algorithmic ways to identify these things. Final thing I really want to make the point of is that where you see all of this stuff, if it does connect to broader cultural things, and remember that graph, there were differences between countries. That's not platform, that is people. That is within our capability to make those differences. Those differences should show up in other data sources. If you look at the New Zealand election study and the Australian election study, New Zealand seems to be getting less polarised, while Australia seems to be getting more polarised. If you look at lost wallet studies, New Zealanders go to great lengths to return lost wallets, up to a Scandinavian level. And if you look at the World Values Survey question of would I fight for my country, New Zealanders are, yeah, nah, there's, we don't have enough information to answer that question in a survey. We don't know. Australia, the US, the UK, you seem awfully sure of yourselves and your answers, whether it is yes or no. And I think that reflects New Zealand's desire to have a conversation about these things. And I want to come back to that conversation is where shared understanding gets built. That's kind of my introductory piece.
Fantastic, David. Excellent stuff. Thomas?
Good morning.
Oh, you might want to grab a mic.
Hello. Hi, tēnā koutou, good morning. My name is Thomas Beagle and I'm the chair of the New Zealand Council for Civil Liberties. I'm an early internet user and I got involved in politics by leading a campaign against the current government internet filter. Now, I admit I felt a little bit depressed after hearing some of yesterday's sessions. There are some big problems in the world, and some of them seem very hard to solve. But we're in a situation in this country where the problems are lesser, or possibly just haven't taken root yet. So I do want to offer a few steps towards solutions, ones that I think will at least work in the New Zealand context. But I want to start off by saying why civil liberties are important. Now, I argue for civil liberties, not just for themselves, but because I believe they're a set of rules that make it a better society for all of us, a society that I want to live in. In particular, and something I feel a lot of people miss, is that freedom of expression is a means to that end, not a commandment carved in stone. But it's an end I like. The idea that people can come together to debate the issues and democratically make decisions that will improve the society that we live in. And once we have this end in sight, we can also accept the well-established principle that not all speech is of equal value. Nearly everybody excludes threats of violence, but I also suggest that in an open and democratic society, another example of speech with little or no value is the idea that some people are less than other people. Such speech not only deserves little protection, but we are justified in limiting it because of the harm it does. Now, it's been suggested that the privately owned social media companies don't share any responsibility towards civil liberties, that it's in the scope of government. There's a long answer to that, but my short answer is that if you want to make money by providing the commons, you have to pick up the responsibilities that come with it. I also want to briefly touch on the framework we use at the Council for Civil Liberties to weigh up proposed solutions. When someone proposes a solution to a problem, we think that firstly we need to agree that the problem is a real problem, concur that the solution will be effective, check that any impact on civil liberties will be as minimal as possible, ensure that it's possible to implement in law and administer it fairly with suitable oversight, and importantly, that the proposed solution won't do more damage to our society and our freedoms than the harm that it's attempting to stop. And I want to use this framework to touch on one class of solution, which is passing new laws. And I'm going to be a bit unfair. I'm going to pick on the example of the new NZ government's new internet censorship bill that is currently going through the legislative process, to talk about why I think it's not going to work.
Thomas, hold it closer.
Lawmaking is slow. We're already 2 years past the event the bill was created in reaction to, and I expect it's going to need enough work that it won't be passed this year, and even then it's going to need more further regulation for some parts to take effect. I don't see it has any hope of resolving any of the problems it sets out to resolve. For example, there's a section on banning live streaming of extremist violence that would have had absolutely no impact if it existed 2 years ago. It's chasing old tech, trying to control web content, and ignoring the fact that most people interact with the internet these days through apps. But what it does do is it sets up a government-mandated mass censorship regime that establishes a principle that will be ripe for extending into a much more effective and oppressive scheme in the future. In other words, it fails nearly every part of our test, and its example says to me we're foolish to put our faith in laws to help us with these dynamic, evolving issues. But the social media companies can react fast because they have the levers in their hands. We can see this happening in the great Twitter purge earlier this year, and what both Twitter and Facebook have been doing in flagging disinformation. However, as we've heard at length, they're capricious and arbitrary, inconsistent and reactive. They've shown great reluctance to take any measures that might impact their profit or market share. And the measures they take and the standards they follow are fragmented by country and local concerns. And the one area where they seem to be working together is the GIF-CT, which is limited to terrorism. So what do I want to see them do? Social media is now one of the key places where freedom of expression happens. It's where we debate political issues, communicate directly with politicians, and talk to journalists. But it's also where we see bullying, threats, and harassment. We see people driven off and silenced, thereby reducing freedom of expression for all of us. And that's something I believe that the social media companies have the engineering talent and scale to significantly clean up. There's absolutely no good reason why it still seems so easy to spin up hundreds of accounts and then use them to attack people online. There is no good reason why people can make threats of violence and it takes an age for them to be acted upon badly. There is no good reason why bad actors can weaponise systems that do exist to remove those acting in good faith. Simply put, it's the job of the social media companies to pick up the rubbish on the common, to provide a commons that is fit for purpose. And to extend the metaphor slightly, when it comes to algorithmic radicalisation, it's also their responsibility to stop littering. But we can't leave it solely up to them. I believe that it's our job to provide them with the principles that they can then choose how to implement. These principles should be informed by civil liberties and democratic values. We should also insist on openness and transparency and good process. And I believe we're going to need some form of external oversight with local cultural competency, such as per-country social media ombudsman. Now, I'm not naive enough to believe the social media companies are going to do this willingly. So we're going to need our government to work with other willing governments that share our values, and here I'm particularly looking at the EU, to force them into it. So to summarise, we need to put the onus on social media companies to behave better, and we need to provide them with the frameworks to work within and the impetus to get it done. And this is not a new model. It's very similar to the way we insisted that the old media companies had standards of fairness and accuracy and balance to uphold, as administered in New Zealand by the Broadcasting Standards Authority and the Press Council. The more things change, the more they stay the same. I also want to briefly touch on disinformation, where I think the government can and should step up to augment the work already being done by the big social media by helping to provide better information. Firstly, the government has a duty to be ever more transparent and open about what it knows and what it does. While we may not be able to reach the hardcore conspiracists, publishing solid information provides an alternative and credible set of facts that will help those who are wavering. For example, some of the information and processes around the COVID response have been exemplary, and I hope this continues. Secondly, we need to acknowledge that the advertising dollar now pays for social media, online games, and internet services rather than journalism. Good journalism is a critical part of holding the government to account and helping to build a shared consensus reality. And it may be time to start paying for it directly. The government has already been doing this with Radio NZ, Māori TV, and subsidies for local government reporting. But I think we need to do more of it, and in such a way that it's obviously isolated from political interference. Now, it's pretty obvious that these proposals are the once-over lightly version, but even when taking into account some of the complexities we've all been discussing, I think they're achievable, not least because they are aligned with the current direction of travel. And I think they would go at least some way to reducing social media's threat to our democracy in New Zealand. But before I finish, I want to mention some important civil liberties other than freedom of expression. One such as the right to be free from undue search and seizure, freedom of association, the right to due process, to be innocent until proven guilty, and the right to privacy. These are the civil liberties that are threatened not so much by social media, but by ham-fisted attempts at government regulation, chasing a moving target that they hardly understand. Passing new restrictive laws should never be our first choice of response when we have yet to explore other options. We've heard a lot about the slide to autocracy and fascism at this conference. So let's not rush to give our open and democratic government the legal tools that would allow a future leader to implement it here.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Listen, I want to open it up to questions also because this is so Aotearoa New Zealand centric. But it does occur to me that the business about algorithms is not unlike the windows, at least for the Zoom audience in this room, which respond to a certain temperature and open and close of their own accord. And the same thing happens at Otago Library. And if you're talking about algorithmic transparency, we don't know what temperature that trigger is based around. As a South Asian, I would have liked it to be, some kind of input of South Asians to go into that temperature measurement as to when it is opening and closing. But nobody in the room quite knows about it, and somebody in the room had to go and physically intervene to shut something that automatically opened. So I think that's a good metaphor for around what we are talking about, and what is actually quite unique to Aotearoa New Zealand. This is entirely congruent with my research, David. Anecdotally, when I go to the library here, you have tens of thousands of dollars of equipment just lying around till students kind of come back and then pick it up. And there's such a high trust society that the question has often been asked, what, in your opinion, is Aotearoa New Zealand a template for other countries to learn from? Or is this so exceptional, so unique, that there is actually nothing to learn because you can't actually replicate much of what we are seeing and you are seeing here in terms of what you study and the culture, the timber, the tone, the kind of exchanges that occur simply because New Zealand is New Zealand. So that's something, there's also that Twitter hashtag that responded to a UK person saying that New Zealand was quite awful during the pandemic. And you had thousands and thousands of people putting up wonderful photos of New Zealand saying that it was awful. It was a trolling of a troll. And it was quite fascinating. And one of the things that you see in New Zealand, I'll end by saying, is that influencers are also very different. In Sri Lanka, for example, influencers are exactly those you'll imagine, popular figures, politicians or pop stars or whatever. Here you have a large following, say for example, for politicians and political parties, but influencers within a particular issue or discourse are actually quite ordinary Twitter accounts. And that's quite a unique signature in terms of the conversation that's happening. So just some thoughts on that. Thomas, listen, what do you think are the threats from outside to all of what you mentioned? Because part of the challenge as we move forward, and I've talked about this with certain people in the room, is that NZ society might be fairly inoculated even against the challenges that one sees in studies across the Tasman, but this is not a given. And the pace of threats and risk is both fluid but also accelerating in complexity at pace. So all of what you said, what do you think are the threats that are emergent from outside the contiguous territory of Aotearoa?
Well, the first threat I see is I'd like to actually make sure we don't let Rupert Murdoch buy any of our media companies, because we can see that as a sort of leading division in other countries at the moment.
Thomas, sorry. Closer, hold it closer. Sorry.
Closer, sorry. It's a very heavy mic. And at the same time, I worry that other countries are going to, what David was referring to, other countries do use us as an example. They want to get involved in our fights, or they want to use us as ammunition in their own fights. I think that's a better way of putting it. And we can be damaged by that as it happens. So, but it comes back to that point of, it's a lot of the negative activity, I believe that a lot of the negative activity we see is actually fueled by bots and other easily capturable mechanisms on these social media platforms, which the social media platforms are refusing to clean up. And that's why, by forcing them to do that, we're actually going to help protect ourselves.
David?
For the uniqueness of New Zealand, I'd say no, is the short answer. We're not unique. In a lot of things, we aspire to Scandinavia, who are even better at returning lost wallets, and a lot of other things. But there is some stuff around community, I think, is really critical. Yeah. And that is where a lot of the underlying cohesion and inclusion things that we've been seeing fall into. And I would suggest that in terms of civil response, as it is producing a stochastic defence to things, increasing civil ability, increasing people's participation from groups that have been historically suppressed from participation in the commons, that's all going to increase these stochastic defences. So we've got room to go.
Yes, but a very interesting foundation to build upon. Yeah. Paul, go ahead.
Thank you, Sanjana, and thank you for those comments. I think they're really helpful to have in the discussion and lots to listen to. I wonder if I could just ask about the potential to flip some of this on its head. And the comments you've provided talk about the sense of community in New Zealand and the way we use social media differently. Are there opportunities to use technology in New Zealand to actually build some of that social cohesion even more strongly, to provide for a wider range of voices to be heard? I'm thinking about examples of the use of tech like Polis in places like Taiwan, and some of the work that we've seen in places like Finland. How do you see some of that working and ensuring that, coming to Thomas's point, we actually hear from a wider range of people, that they do have the ability to express their voice in the domestic commons in a way that might not have been enabled prior to some of that technology? Is there an almost unique opportunity for New Zealand to do something interesting in that space, and how would we go about it?
In my response to that, I would immediately like to flag the issues around COVID checking in, where it's kind of plateaued the rate that, and if people want to get it up, there's been a lot of discussion about enforcement. However, a much more viable and legal path would be digital inclusion of people who can't currently scan in. I think there is a very strong parallel for inclusion, for support, for making historically marginalised groups, giving them enough support that they trust institutions, and then can essentially protect themselves against the conspiracy theories that thrive in low trust environments and things like that. So yes, I think there is a lot of space in there, is my thoughts.
I agree with those. I'd also like to make two statements, because I believe that at least in New Zealand at the moment, firstly, we've got freedom of expression is doing better now than it hasn't ever in the past. And I'd like to say that participation in government decisions is doing better now than it ever has in the past. So we're not starting from a position where we're going down. I'm saying we're actually starting from a high point now, and we can go up. And one example I'll give of that is that my sister works at Parliament, and she's dealing with the huge amounts of submissions they actually receive on bills, because it has been made easier and so on. So coming back to the other point about making sure we can include everyone, which is something that I'm very, very keen on, the idea that there are people out there who are being excluded. And I think that mentioning the digital inclusion, that actually having the tools to do it, and also making sure that those large environments, the ones where the most people are actually safe places for people to actually be able to communicate without being driven away. And I think, sure, we can then start talking about individual tools to use, but if we just achieve that much, I think we will already be growing and gaining so much as it is.
Jeremy, we have a question from Zoom.
Yes, we have a question from Tarina, who has been closely participating in our conversation. What contribution do you see, David and Thomas, indigeneity making in this space? How is indigeneity impacted here, and how does it contribute? And we might even need to define what do we mean by indigeneity.
I think yesterday's session's comments around repurposing of digital spaces is something that should be absolutely to our forefronts. The experience of those communities in taking what there was in the platforms. But more importantly, I think as a Pākehā, middle-aged New Zealander, if historically marginalised communities are getting enough support and the society is inclusive enough for them to be able to speak freely and with confidence in the public space, that is a marker of a strong and good society as a value.
I'd like to support that, and I'd also like to say that one of the things we talk about is very important for us is we also talk about a democratic and pluralistic society, which means that maybe we need to work out different solutions for different people as suits them, and by asking them what they need. And so I'm not going to try and speak to what they can do, but I want us to be thinking about, how do we use these systems to actually produce allow different people from different spaces and different times in their life and everything else to make sure that they can also can contribute and feel safe in doing so.
Any other questions from the room? Sorry, Kim, I thought as much, actually. I saw you frowning.
Thomas, you took us through a framework that you developed, and it sounded really interesting, but I didn't manage to get down all the points. So I wonder, could you tell us about the framework again?
Well, it's a very simple framework, because it really is trying to say that because people keep on proposing laws, and those laws are often to solve problems, and then they start asking us, they say, well, why are you complaining about it? The impact on it. And one of the first things you've got to do is the idea that firstly, will your proposal actually solve the problem you're trying to create, you're trying to resolve? And because many of them don't. And the one example I gave today was one which doesn't. You actually look at everything it's trying to do, and it doesn't hit any of them. And then after that, you then go through that. Well, even if we accept that, can we do it well? Can we have the right oversight and accountability? Can we implement it in a sensible manner without a ridiculous cost? I mean, we don't take the costing into account ourselves, but other people have to. And will it do more damage to society than actually the harm it's trying to resolve? And that's what we see a lot when it comes to internet law. It's the idea that, we need to have massive control of the internet to stop this particular thing happening. And we're going to ignore the fact that that's going to do a lot more damage to a lot of other places, and we're going to have a net detriment to society from this law rather than net positive.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to pick up on the indigeneity question, because I think for some people that is sort of a concept that lacks a lot of substance. And I wonder if we talked about it in terms of, in Aotearoa, the Treaty of Waitangi, which provides a sort of an indigenous framework for inclusion. It's a kind of an indigenous social contract, is my understanding. Are there other, perhaps, other social contracts that are operating in New Zealand society that make this, Thomas, you talked about being sort of on a high point of people feeling like they can make submissions. Are there other things that we haven't seen yet that you have seen, and also David, that are contributing to this sense of we have our voice matters in this community?
I don't have a good answer for that.
With respect to Te Treaty, I would say this is where I look at lots of data sets. If you go back through time with the New Zealand election study, you can see that Pākehā New Zealand has moved massively on support and acceptance that Te Treaty is a founding document of New Zealand.
Around what time?
Over the past 20 years.
Okay.
You can. It's not just younger people coming through; it's older people changing their mind as well. It's been a foundational shift in New Zealand about pluralism and acceptance. I don't know offhand of other equally significant documents, but you can see the significance of that across lots of data sets.
Any other questions from the room? I have one here online. Facebook's community standards set out its grounds for hate speech with exceptional clarity and probably go much further than most people realize. Given that the European Commission has already found Facebook removes 90% of hate speech before it has ever been seen by anybody and responds to 97.5% of hate speech reports within 24 hours of it being reported, what is good enough when it comes to our expectations for them? What is the standard, perhaps, that we're looking for?
Okay, I'll comment on that one. That's possibly hate speech. I think we need to actually look at. It's not what's coming into the hopper; it's what's coming out of the hopper. And the effects we're seeing, I believe, are that people, not just in hate speech but in other areas, are being harassed and are still being, death threats and threats of violence and so on. So I've got to say that if that's the current rate, it's not good enough yet, because that's what we're looking at stopping.
I would add, that sounds like a threshold question to me. What is the bar? I personally am of the opinion that we don't have bars, we have goals. And, I would support the values of an inclusive society where people can speak without being threatened, and that's the direction I always want to go in. And I would like the social media companies to make it easier to go in that direction, rather than any level.
No, I mean, maybe that question was a bit general. It's actually 97.4%. The point, the percentage matters. It's also, red flagging is very different to removal. So these are on the one hand technical and semantics, but they matter. They matter a great deal for persons of color, for transgendered people, for minorities, for people at the margins of society, but happen to find themselves at the butt end of violence, hate, hurt, and harm, that the platforms tend to kind of gloss over as a consequence of exactly that kind of media reportage, which focuses on what they are purportedly doing as opposed to what slips through the cracks affecting millions. So, don't get me started on this issue and the PR spin that takes away from what needs to be done. Yes, there is a lot that has been done, but there is much more that should be done, particularly outside of the European Union and both sides of the Atlantic. So I think that these social media companies need to take that on board as well. I think we've come to...
We have one more online.
Very, very quickly, yeah.
Okay. Who guards the guardians? As someone once said, what do you think what do you both think about the consciousness of civil society here in New Zealand in terms of protecting civil liberties, but also in terms of maintaining privacy and freedom from unnecessary state interference?
Thomas, that seems a question.
It does, doesn't it? I think there's actually a great goodwill in New Zealand towards civil liberties and privacy as principles, and in particular cases as well. But also there's times when people will propose things which are superficially attractive, but they don't see of the impacts. And that's partly what our job is, to say, like, hang on a minute, you haven't thought of those impacts, and so on. I'm going to leave it there, actually.
I'd say civil society guards the guardians, but civil society guarding the guardians depends on the guardians, i.e. the government's willingness to support civil society in guarding it. So there's a reciprocal relationship there.
And just related to that, there's one other point I'd like to make, is that one of the reasons we are tough on the government, and tough on the government being open and transparent and doing the right things, is it actually means that we can have a high trust in our government. And I think that's a very important point, because that gives us the ability to, we guard the government, shall we say, they then act in a trustworthy way, which means that we can then trust them to do things like tell us all to stay home for 4 weeks because of the COVID. And that's an important part of building a strong society.
A short one is okay. A short one, though.
Not sure how short this one is, but I'll give it a go. So yeah, you're talking about guardians. I wasn't sure when to implement this question, but I think now's a better time than ever. In regards to tax evasion and the role of social media corporations and the tax they owe for particularly developing nations where hundreds of billions of dollars are owed the world over, developing nations especially, billions of dollars are owed. Do you think our government in particular could champion this idea of holding social media corporations to account for the loss of tax money, so we can support our civil liberties, our democracies, so we can support our democracies, so our education systems, our health systems, so that we aren't lacking that infrastructure. Do you think that New Zealand could champion this?
I would say New Zealand has a disproportionate public profile compared to soft power, if you're coming to some common conclusions about.
Thomas, briefly.
The whole issue of multinational tax and money streams. I mean, New Zealand is as much of a victim as some of those other countries as well. I don't have any good solutions for it, but if we don't have working tax systems and working oversight and so on, we're all going to suffer from it. So it's a thing that's in the interest of the world to solve.
And there's a broad question. It's a good question. And perhaps out of the forum as well, you can engage with the members over lunch. We have several representatives from government. Ask them directly. It is a good question, though. It was a very surreal session for me because the quality of the engagement, the nature of the debate, the high level with which citizens interact with government is sadly alien to many other parts of the world. And that is why I also included this session, because I think Aotearoa New Zealand bears study and reflection simply because I don't think that many of you within the country quite realize, and I use the word quite consciously, how lucky you are to have the quality of the debate that you have on shared problems, but not deal with the kind of challenges in addressing those problems that some of us in the rest of the world have to think about. As we heard in the final session of yesterday, there are individuals around the world who are dealing with existential crises as they address the questions of this session. Aotearoa New Zealand does not have that burden, which of course means that the individuals in charge of public policy and answering some of these questions have a great, to quote Spider-Man, a great power, but also a great responsibility to perhaps provide and promote and produce a template that the rest of the world can emulate. So David and Thomas, thank you very much for bringing an Aotearoa New Zealand perspective and a reflection on a country that I've been very fortunate to be in for 3 years. Thank you very much, and a warm round of applause. For those of you on Zoom, we are going to break here, at least in Dunedin, for an hour for lunch. So please join the live stream again in around 55 to 60 minutes. Thank you.
something else actually really positive happened, which was the young people with Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to our session on youth and social media. We have a number of local New Zealand young people with us to share some of their experiences. We have Alexi from the classifications office, works with David Shanks here and friends. And we also have Dante and Haley from School Strike for Climate, Dunedin. And I wanted to point out that 2 years ago, on the day of the Christchurch attacks, something else actually really positive happened, which was the School Strike for Climate, which was generally overshadowed by that event. My own daughter was the key organizer here in Dunedin, and so she referred Dante and Haley to share at this presentation. But that was, to me and for many, was a significant and important sort of milestone in organizing around our environmental issues and really the concerns of so many. So we want to sort of come back to that and really hear from them how that has evolved, how has that changed, how has social media been part of that process over the past 2 years, and then Alexi will also share some of his experience with the classifications office. So thank you. I'll turn it over to Alexi.
Hi everyone, so my name's Alexi. I'm 18 years old and I'm originally from Wellington, and I've recently just moved down to Dunedin a couple of weeks ago for my studies. So I'm a part of the Office in Film and Literature Classifications Youth Advisory Panel. So that's basically where we aim to integrate a youth voice into the organisation, which is basically, for those who don't know, the Crown entity that classifies media here in New Zealand. So on the panel, we've done a huge variety of things, from helping out with social media campaigns to giving input to new policy, or even helping them out with classifications that have relevance or a high impact to young people. So for today's presentation, basically, I'm just going to talk about social media from a young person's point of view. So I'm going to start by mapping out some of my personal experience and use with social media. And then I'm going to move on to talk in a bit more greater detail about some of the work that I've done at the Classification Office, influencing government alongside a real cool panel of young people. And then finally, I'm going to tie it kind of all together with offering some ideas about maybe how a youth voice could kind of be put into the wider field of social media, and maybe why that could be really significant. So social media for me is definitely a bit of a double-edged sword. It can facilitate some awesome moments. I love going onto Insta and seeing what my old friends are up to from when I was an exchange student in France, because we might be a foreign language and several thousand kilometers apart from each other, but we can still stay connected. And I also love going onto Messenger and seeing what my high school friends are up to, after they've moved into their halls. I really feel like I'm there to experience it with them. Yeah, and I just think social media in general, it gives you a chance to catch a glimpse into other people's lives. Sometimes it might be a glimpse of someone who you met briefly and then you parted ways. And then that's kind of the digital link that keeps you connected. Or it could be the complete opposite, where it's a close friend, and even if you saw them an hour ago, it's still really satisfying to see a picture of your hangout pop up on your phone. But these platforms, they do have their pitfalls. Immediately what comes to mind for me is Instagram stories, because basically that's a code word for a live stream 24/7 of who's hanging out with who. I see this as having two main implications. From a viewer's side, it really exacerbates our perception of being excluded, because it gives us this idea that everyone around us is better off. It also transports us from, instead of being in the present moment, to really thinking about the who, the what, the when, the why, and the how of other people's lives, rather than what you're actually currently doing. The other impact, which really comes to mind for me, is the impact from the poster's side. It really quantifies the need for social interaction, and it almost gives a sense that you need to reciprocate what you see others doing on the app. for this like kind of sense of social approval. But this idea of like relationships and being quantified is really present like across all of social media. Like if you make the most of all the new updates, you can have like a public Instagram account, a private, like a close friend story. Like really like who you let in is completely up to you. Like social media is really like the control room, and we can pull all the levers and allow who we want into our lives and what kind of type of glimpse that is and how others perceive like our lives to be. Like, I don't think ever before friendships have so specifically been put into kind of distinct boxes, and that's really changed like the social dynamic of relationships as a young person. But sometimes the positives and negatives of social media can like come in shades of grey. Like take Snapchat. One of the main parts of the app is sending streaks, which is basically like daily face pictures to that, you know, that friend of a friend of a friend. For some, like people, it really seems to be like an incessant barrage of actions, and it's kind of perpetually keeping us tied to our phones. But then on the other side of the coin, some people really like it. It's like a really easy way to stay connected to such a large network of people in like a really chill environment. Although I do have to say, guys, I am actually an ex-Snapchat user now. I've got a big confession to make. Somehow I'm able to stay connected to everyone between Instagram, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, iMessage, and text, but like only just. Like some people, it's like a real mission. So I don't know, if you catch up with me sometime next year, maybe I will have conceded and be on Snapchat. I guess we'll have to watch this space. But it's safe to say though that for young people, like Snapchat's definitely where it's at. And Facebook like seems to be being used like less and less. Because take it back a couple years, it was really where like everyone went. Like people would update their profile pictures and they'd get like a whole lot of really nice comments, and people would also publicly say happy birthday, and they'll do it with like a whole lot of really embarrassing photos. And so that would be like there for like everyone and like future employers and all that to see. But luckily that seems to be a thing in the past, which is I think for the best. But so when I go onto Facebook now, it'll basically be just a check-in to stuff that I've liked, or maybe like a club or something that I'm into. And then occasionally like my friends will tag me in something really random but funny. Like actually just like on my way here, I logged into Facebook and my friend tagged me in something, and it was basically like this world championship for Excel spreadsheets. And someone's like, oh yeah, no, this is you. And like, so that was kind of cool. I was like, oh, interesting. But yeah, I think overall, if we look at social media, like I think we can all agree that it brings both positives and negatives, like satisfaction and discontentment, into our lives. I think both at the same time, we are architects, and equally we're hostages to it. But if we do like only want to kind of be like drivers for change on social media, I think one of the key obstacles faced by us is young people being able to be educated users, so that they can kind of use them usage in moderation and kind of in a way where you can more critically understand like how the content's affecting you. But sometimes this kind of just really doesn't seem realistic or achievable, because the symbol of like social media addiction in young people has become quite synonymous with each other, and it's quite like an overly pessimistic kind of adult voice in both the media and in real life portraying this. And it's not like it's necessarily factually invalid, but I think the key takeaway is that kind of the communication strategy of portraying young people as just people who are glued to their phones, like it doesn't really come with practical solutions, and it does actually have kind of an insidious byproduct of it, in that people are just kind of disengaged from like talking about social media and its impacts. Like I think if we look at it in the media, for example, like I don't know if any of you have seen like the Black Mirror and like the episode Nosedive. Yeah, like it gave like a really astute social commentary on how like social media plays into our lives, but it does not really bring any like practical solutions with it. Like the protagonist Lacey, she had to go to jail and quit social media altogether to finally be happy. So that's not practical for any of us, I don't think. The Netflix doco, The Social Dilemma, is a really similar story. Like, it sheds light on the power that social media has on our lives over like a range of like talking to people in the industry and stuff like that. And I found it really intriguing to listen from their perspective, but it also doesn't come with practical solutions. Like in one of the scenes, the son like smashes this lockbox bought to seal his phone during dinner time, and kind of that just shows that he just, even if he's consciously trying to really not engage with that, he just can't. So I think like it does to some extent make the situation quite futile, like to listen to. It can be really just quite disengaging to constantly hear the negative effects of social media without being given any actual like tools to react to it. Because yeah, as a young person, like social media is really like the digital kind of infrastructure of our lives in both the digital and the physical world. Like whether it's like the underwater hockey group chat or if it's like my friend's 18th birthday is an event on Facebook, there's constantly reasons for us to be going there, and it's really, like I said, just like a part of our infrastructure. Because very quickly it can become a very like hypothetical discourse without kind of concrete actions kind of taking place. So I understand why sometimes young people can feel a little bit emotionally kind of uninvested. If we do really want to meaningfully tackle the kind of regulatory challenges associated with social media, we really need to involve and include, not lecture young people along the way. That's why I think we need a youth voice like right now and not at some point in the future. Because people quite often talk about the hope for the next generation and what they will do, but what's really important is that I think this mentality needs to be shifted to be more present focused, because there's a lot really which we can achieve right now. So as a member of the Classification Officers Youth Advisory Panel back in Wellington, I, alongside around 15 other young people, were able to influence decisions across the government, and we contributed to like a youth voice being present at all these different levels. So some of the stuff we've done, for example, is like during lockdown, we interpreted the Netflix documentary Tiger King, which maybe some of you guys have seen. I definitely binge watched it during lockdown. And from this meeting, some of the notes were formulated, and the classification office actually recommended that new and additional notes be added to the title. Later in the year, we worked on a range of digital campaigns, so with a focus of young people in the digital age. So we helped out the Department of Internal Affairs with one of their online safety campaigns. So it consisted of young people chatting online to each other, and we worked with them to ensure that the wording used was kind of up to date with the lingo of young people, because sometimes there can be a bit of a disconnect. We also helped the classification office with a social media campaign about young people and porn. So we helped them generate ideas for content so that people could have like a discussion and in an open space about the topic, which for some people can be a really sensitive topic. It was really cool actually when like I saw both these campaigns come out, because literally on my own social media feed, because it's like, oh, I like played a small role in that, and it was really satisfying because they actually took on board a lot of our feedback, which was really nice. We've also done a bit of outreach, so like to spread the word in the community about like what we've been up to. So I spoke at the Youthline Wellington AGM about young people in the digital world, and other members in the panel even actually gave a submission at Parliament about a new legislation basically which is requiring online streaming providers like Netflix to actually display the New Zealand classification. So yeah, it's really refreshing to work with organisations who value the input of young people and acknowledge our time by really finding ways to integrate our ideas into practical actions. So how might this apply in like the field of social media? Well, as a young person, our lives are ever intertwined with interactions across the different platforms. So as such key stakeholders, it really makes sense that young people should have a voice at the table for discussing the decisions that are being made. Because as I said before, we're not just the future generation, but right now, we are the group of people that are so deeply impacted by both the benefits and, more importantly, the harms of social media. Collectively, we really need to work to reduce these harms, and through sharing our insights, we'll definitely help new ideas come to light. Equally, it'll ensure that proposals are actually relevant to young people, because a lot of the time they're the group that the decisions are being made for. At the end of the day, young people are experts at being young people in the digital world. So for us to truly be architects, we really need to be given a seat at the table. Otherwise, we're simply onlookers, and some could even use the phrase hostage, to the social media apps and those who make related decisions. So, whether it be the next big government policy which is regulating one of the big social media players, or it could be a research project in the wider field of social media, young people, or really anything at all in the digital sphere, I really urge you to engage with and truly listen to young people. Ask them what they think about how might the proposition play out in the real world, and if it would actually impact their usage and relationships of the different apps. Or maybe you could find out how your proposal could be communicated to a youth demographic by actually going out there and just talking to young people. Even at first glance, if there doesn't seem to be a natural way to include a youth voice, I really urge you to endeavour to find one, because you'll be surprised with what we can come up with. Thanks.
Thanks, Alexi. That was great. We'll just go straight into Dante and Haley's presentation, which we have a PowerPoint for.
Can we have a clicker thing, please? Kia ora, I'm Haley, I'm 16 and I'm at Kavanagh College. I'm also part of School Strike for Climate Otipoti.
I'm Dante, I'm 17 years old. I go to Logan Park High School. I'm a full-time school student.
And so we'll just get right into it. So what is School Strike? Who are we? Essentially, a grassroots movement influenced by Greta Thunberg, so a 16-year-old who protested outside of her parliament for climate justice. So in New Zealand, we were influenced by her, and so, thanks. And so we banded together and we did about 3 strikes in 2019. Yeah. So in 2020, obviously we had a bit of a hiccup with strikes because obviously strikes are big gatherings and you can't actually strike during a pandemic, as we found out. So some of the things we did was an online strike. So on May 15th, School Strike held an online strike by utilizing social media to essentially share what we were doing down here and across the world, well, across New Zealand mostly. And so what we did in Dunedin is we did a chalking event in the Octagon. So here are some of the chalks we did, and we took photos and we posted it all over social media.
And one of the things, so obviously we were hoping to use social media a lot more than we did. One of like the big overarching plans we had was that if we could somehow get like people all over the country to like go chalk on the concrete outside their houses and post pictures of that. We didn't really manage that quite as well because one of like the big strengths of social media and activism is the interactive element of it. And we kind of more focused on like posting things of what we were doing and not encouraging people to submit things they were doing. But yeah, anyway. These are a few other things we've been able to do on our social media. We primarily use Instagram because we've found that that's where we get like the most youth engagement.
Yeah, so on the, I think that's the right for you guys, or is it the left? That's our national Instagram page. We recently got a blue check, which is pretty cool. And so essentially we use our Instagram to spread information that's happening around New Zealand regarding the climate crisis. So we've got a graphic about how the climate emergency was to be declared in Parliament, and then we've got some history about the Māori Language Week, and then this graphic was posted for when the elections nights gave us the results. And so 100 Days for Action was one of our biggest campaigns that we did on social media. So this was essentially a campaign to present Parliament our demands for the first 100 days of government. So we had quite a few posts, as you can see. We did a couple videos, one launching the campaign with a bunch of coordinators from around New Zealand, and then another video with people from the community saying what they wanted from government. And this was probably the best use of social media we had.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, because it was quite engaging and it really grew our platform.
So another thing we did very recently is we produced like a simplified report on the Climate Change Commission's report, and we're encouraging people to make submissions. So that's been something a lot of activist groups around the country have been doing. It's been a big focus recently. And so School Strike were like working on that as well to like, because the Climate Change Commission report was quite a lengthy and intense read, and a lot of just average 16, 15-year-olds don't have time or the interest in that. So we wanted to make it more accessible to them. So we created like a series of like simplified main points of the Commission's report and a guide to submissions and things like that. And we also, we looked briefly through our social medias to see what kind of reactions we get. Generally, it's pretty positive. As School Strike is a relatively mainstream activist group, most of the public response we get is positive. We looked through a couple of the different platforms which we're on, so Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And Facebook was the only one where we really actually encountered any negative or like strange responses. So we've got a few examples of that here. Like my personal favourite, change is a meaningless word. They've moved on from climate change is meaningless to just change is meaningless. But yeah, generally we actually get a pretty positive reception in that aspect of social media.
Right, so now we will dive into our personal perspectives on social media. Do you want to start on that?
Yeah, okay, I can start on that. So I'm not really a very typical teen in my use of social media. I don't actually use it that much. I do have Instagram, I have Facebook, and Facebook is probably what I use the most just because a lot of organizations use that as a way to like keep connected. Instagram is definitely, I'd say, what like most of my peers at school use the most. So before this presentation, I talked to a bunch of my peers at school, my friends and like people I didn't know as well, about how they felt about social media and, you know, the pros and cons, and a couple of words came up frequently when I was asking them about how they felt like adults and people who worked in social media things perceived their relationship with social media, and those words were predominantly dismissive and hypocritical. So I think this is a big thing that's come out after the pandemic and with like recent issues globally, is that it often feels to a lot of young people like the policymakers and the adults in charge of social media and even their parents are dismissive of connections they form online. I mean, it's drilled into our head all the time that like social media is no substitute for real human interaction. But like the flip side of that is it implies that your interactions online, the friendships you can build over years, over so many shared interests, don't mean anything. And this is super dismissive and doesn't really take into effect like the importance social media and the internet has in our lives. As like Alexei mentioned briefly, like we're experts at being young people on social media because we've grown up with it and it is part of our lives. It is a culture of its own. And I often feel like, at least, a lot of like the research and the study that goes into social media and online cultures is entirely focused on the negatives. Like all the studies are about how bad our mental health is. All the headlines are condemning social media platforms. All of like the research papers are about the effects, the negative effects. And again, that feels really dismissive to like the entire culture that's been built on the internet of so many inside jokes and like different communities and different attitudes towards each other, and like an entire world which is often dismissed as just kids are glued to their phones these days. I think this is also really important with like the state of the world right now, with the various issues like, for example, the Black Lives Matter campaign, which had like a massive presence on social media, and because it was happening a lot in America. And for a lot of young people, they have online friends. And their online friends were in a bit of danger in various places. And there's like a sense of connection to the rest of the world, which I've personally felt that a lot of adults don't understand quite as well. Because now we live in the age of social media, it's impossible to think of yourself as just a citizen of one country, because it's so easy to, like, as Alexei said, catch a glimpse into other people's lives. You can form connections with people from all these different cultures, with all these different experiences. You become basically a global citizen, though it's a bit of like a, you know, like overused word. But I think it is important to think about. And about like the distress that causes a lot of young people. And I think especially in New Zealand, because it often feels like we're at the bottom of the world and we're so lucky, and especially of the pandemic, we've been constantly told, oh, how lucky you are to be in New Zealand. And again, this feels dismissive of like the worry we have for our online friends, for people all over the world who are in real present danger, who are really struggling with things. But because like online friendships and those connections are always dismissed as inherently inferior to real connections, we don't feel like we can talk about our experiences with that as much. So that's basically what I had to say to start with.
Yeah, exactly what Dante said. I think that the portrayal of social media is more harmful than social media itself. Constantly, our generation is told that our misuse of social media is the reason we have mental health issues. Like, for an instance, I was speaking to an elected council member down here once like a couple months ago about what the biggest issues that Utipoti youth face. And I was talking about how we need better support for our mental health services. And they replied, yeah, mental health is a big issue for youth. It's because of social media. And just things like that, which are so dismissive and frankly patronizing to go through constantly by adults and people who should have our well-being as their best interest. It's super demoralizing, and just knowing that there's such a disconnect between the generations and social media, because we grew up with social media. It's ingrained into us. It's no longer a tool that we use or something we go on a couple hours a day. It's a part of our communication, the way we work, the way we see the world, and the way we learn, essentially. And I think that that's something that everyone that's over our age kind of needs to understand, that it's not a matter of taking the goods from social media and disregarding the bads, or only highlighting the bads and forgetting about the goods. It's two sides of the same coin. You can't, and I think that we have to see how we can improve from that, especially with talking about how our relationships on social media aren't as valid as ones in person. That's completely invalid, because a lot of people, they don't have people around them in the real world, but they have those connections online, especially in houses that are more conservative. You can be yourself on social media where you can't really in person. And I think that a lot of the benefits of social media are really lost with all of the harm, because yeah, there's harm, but where isn't there with anything that we grow up with? Like, if you think about the big fads of your generation, there was harms, there was goods. And that's something that we have to remember is with social media. And it is a learning curve that we're all going through. But becoming extremely dismissive is only going to harm it more. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to build on actually something Hayley touched on earlier there around mental health and mental illness and social media. I mean, I think most people who have who keep their eyes on social media and youth culture are aware of this intense trend of glamorizing mental illness. And this is definitely an issue on particular platforms, in particular TikTok actually, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And I was tempted to talk more about that and how much of an impact that has. Then I realized I think there are enough people talking about that. There aren't enough people talking about the communities online. And there aren't enough people talking about, again, the connections you can build. And over the pandemic, this became painfully obvious, as after being told our whole lives that the connections we were building online were just inherently inferior and not worth our time, we now had to, those were what we were being encouraged to have. And while this does come across as hypocritical, I think I'd like to see it as more of a chance, as an opportunity, as all of us now are united in the fact that we often have to use online things and online interactions. And if we go into another lockdown, which I really hope we don't, but we'll all be united under that. It won't just be the youth. And I think it would be a great opportunity for older people to start to realize the importance of online connections, internationally especially, to young people, and the effect that can have on actually political views and social politics and growing up in that kind of environment, is that we aren't just growing up in a New Zealand political environment, we are exposed to the entire world, basically. And that really impacts people. And that really, I think it can be a force for good. There's often a lot of insulting of my generation for being glued to their phones and not caring about real people. And that seems, again, be completely dismissive of all the work that's done online in the community building and the resource building. And again, I'd like to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, about how online people from all over the world managed to create great resources for people who are endangered, and protest tips, and just a massive movement that was online, because we couldn't reach those areas physically, but we can still help. And that's one of the things that social media has great potential for, but I don't think it's talked about enough, because it's easy to insult social media, it's easy to look down on it, and it's easy to consider it superficial and just teenagers posting pictures of their face. And sure, there is a lot of that, but I think the importance of it is very much disregarded.
Yeah, and just summing up that, the amount of information and knowledge and education that I personally get from social media outranks anything I see on the news. Like, social media is such an accessible platform for a numerous amount of things. Like, I've learned so much about indigenous cultures, mental health issues, and just like how to be a better person and how to support my friends with anxiety or how to support my friends with ADHD and things like that, which they don't show you on local news. And like things like that are valid forms of education and things that aren't even taught in my school. Like, I don't get taught how, hey, my friend's having a panic attack, how should I help them? No, I find something on Instagram, I swipe through the post and I understand what to do. And obviously you can't apply one social media post to everything in your life, but there's so many social media posts with individual anecdotes and experiences that you can build off of and you can learn, and just like take a moment to realize just how powerful social media can be when it comes to education, and then continue that conversation.
Thank you. So, I think the adults have been put on notice on some certain aspects of our interaction as a parent. I can understand that. Thank you for that feedback. And yes, but a quick question. I wanted to come back to Alexi. You had talked about having sort of friends in different boxes. What can you say more about that? What does that look like? And this would also anyone can be welcome to answer this question.
Yeah, if I need to elaborate a bit more. I just find this concept really interesting, that we kind of draw a line and say this person belongs in this kind of account, and I'm going to kind of portray myself in this light. And then the kind of the difference between like someone's public Instagram account versus if you look on their private one, for example, where there's quite a big difference in how we communicate, which is natural because I guess in life we have like a personal, professional context, but just it seems to be a lot more widespread and a lot more complex on the field of social media, I guess.
Yeah, just building on that, social media can be so exposing. And so having, like, for example, I have a public Instagram account, and anyone can see that. You can search my name up, and it shows up some of the things I've done. But I've got a private Instagram for close friends, because sometimes there are things where I don't really want to share to 100 or 300 people, or I don't really want my family members who sometimes stalk me on Instagram to see. And just applying it to different situations, like if somebody isn't out of a closet, or if they have things that they want to share specifically, or even if you just want to have like a fun Instagram account where you don't feel judged because you have just close friends on that account who can interact with it. I think that's kind of what you were meaning. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's often seen as like a feature of Instagram, but it also holds true for like a whole variety of social media platforms. And like, of course, on different platforms, people are completely different people. And that's another important factor, is that Instagram for a lot of youth is like a very personal thing, as well as having personal private accounts on Instagram. On Facebook, people tend to be more professional. On things like Snapchat, people are a lot more casual because it's like such an instantaneous thing. And that's another thing where social media gets generalized a lot, and different platforms have a lot of pros and cons, and they're very different things, I think. So we can talk about social media as a whole, but if we want to actually address problems with it, you have to be a bit more specific as to which platform you mean, because they all have like different failings and strengths, and some aren't even talked about that much. Like, for example, Tumblr, which is a blogging website, which has like massive communities which have gone like, and as a website, the culture on it has definitely evolved over the years. Like, I've seen like the culture on the website evolve from something quite destructive and bad to now much healthier, and because like the owners of the website and like the company that ran it never did any like proper policing of it, everything got really bad for a while, but the website learned to self-police itself. And whereas you have comparisons with like TikTok, for example, which is a relatively new social media, so like that kind of culture and acceptance of like various things on the platform hasn't built up. So at the moment, it's quite a dangerous place for like destructive content. and things like that. So to like approach the problem of social media, if you want to call it a problem, you can't just talk about social media. You have to talk about each thing.
Thanks, Dante. And I think that's really important for us to consider that it is not a one-size-fits-all, and that there are different faces of the Facebook and the different social media platforms. We have some questions from online.
Well, we have one question. We have one question. How can young people protect themselves from risks of scams and romance cons from long-term scammers, especially in Aotearoa, which promotes a trust culture? This can impact on anyone of any age, like the Tender Trap on TV this week. I don't know what that is, but maybe you guys do. About a woman in her 50s who became a drug mule because of a romance con. I suppose the question for the panel is, how do we form rules for keeping social connections as real as possible? And his thoughts are.
Okay, so 2 questions. Are there rules that can be had for the relationships which you've really talked positively about, but there certainly are some dangers? How are those navigated? How do you all navigate those?
Right. I think there's a difference between an online friendship and an encounter where somebody presents like a, hey, do you want to send me money, or do you want to go hang out? I know you from this. I think that my generation has become pretty decent at weeding out what is spam and what is the person who talks to you for weeks on end. And you can tell when it's a bot most of the time. But I guess with younger children, it might be a bit more confusing if someone's like, hey, if you do this, then I will send you $1,000. Like, yeah, those are scams that everyone can fall for, but I think that it's more an issue of educating kids, like, hey, don't talk to strangers like this. You know, make sure you know that you can verify this person isn't going to harm you. But also, it's a question of why aren't these platforms preventing these harms to children? It's not. I think one of the biggest issues we have with our society is prepping victims not to be victimized instead of telling people not to harm people. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say that's definitely a big point, and that I think a really important question, like moving forward with social media, is how much responsibility for safety does the user take, and how much does the company take? And often, the companies talk a lot about safety and without doing much, and so the responsibility falls on the users. And because there isn't actually much education out there as to like practically how to stay safe online, a lot of it is basically just telling you you shouldn't be online as much as you are, which is again kind of preachy, and people are going to stop listening as soon as you start talking about that. So I think it would have to be a combined effort between like companies and like platforms creating regulations and like education and acceptance of social media as like a thing that has many sides to it.
Thank you very much for the question. So I think basically my response to that would be is that I think young people overall, as we alluded to before, are just a bit tired of kind of having this theme of social media being like this, we're being told that this is the source of all our problems. And I think if we're a bit more empowered to kind of actually have like a voice and kind of sharing how we use social media and the lens in which we view things to basically the people who are making the decisions. Like I think, as Dante and Hayley talked about before, each app kind of almost has a different flavour, and this flavour is constantly evolving in the way in which we use it in our relationship with it. And I think kind of that provides a lot of value for people who are trying to tackle these really big issues. And I think if they had a good understanding of that from young people, I think that could really help when they're trying to come up with kind of potential solutions as to how can we tackle this. Well, I think the first step is looking at how young people use them.
Thanks, Dante. Do we have any questions?
Nothing from
lots
Zoom.
of questions. I think we're hearing that we need to understand not just the apps, but the culture, the flavor, as Dante said, of the apps, and how does that app taste to its users or its consumers. So we're going to the audience.
Kia ora everyone, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. My question is, just thinking about any of the platforms that you use, is there anything you'd like to change about how they work to make a better experience for yourself?
I think less of an emphasis on ads and algorithms. I think there's a massive disconnect between like social media as like a cultural context and social media as a business. And I think combining those two things and like having more communication between those two areas.
Yeah, what Dante said, and also more of a regulation on misinformation, because I think that a lot of people, especially presidents or ex-presidents, like to put out misinformation, and a lot of young people are exposed to this, and I know that it's really easy to click on one thing and then enter an echo chamber into just misinformation and really bad radical, like right-wing radicalism, and I think that that's something I would definitely change, yeah.
Yeah, I think just building off what Dante said about the ads, I sometimes feel like the ads on social media kind of try and reinforce like stereotypes about young people. Like as soon as I moved down to Dunedin, now every time I go on Facebook, every different alcohol brand has ads every time. And I'm like, okay, so is this kind of how, 18-year-olds are categorized? So I think that would be kind of good, is how can we use the platform to kind of spread social change and kind of, positive values and messages?
We have another question from the audience.
First, I found that COVID-19 changed my attitude towards social media quite considerably, because I was in touch with American friends and family because of COVID-19 in a way I wouldn't have been in normal circumstances. But when you talked about privacy, I was a bit confused, because I know when I used to send letters, I could assume those letters would remain private. I could say almost anything, and I didn't even fear from the government. But I've never believed that I can say anything on social media or the net or even on the phone that's necessarily going to remain private. It may remain private from friends and casual people, but it won't remain private from corporations and governments. And I wonder about that notion. I wonder if we're a bit naive. I mean, I still say things, but I know that I'm at risk. And maybe if I lived in my home country, I wouldn't say those things.
Do you have a specific question around privacy for...
So what do you do? I think you have how do you deal with that aspect of privacy?
David, you got to stop listening to conversations, man.
Well, honestly, I think to a lot of young people, it doesn't occur to them that much. And I think that is like a big blind spot in social media awareness. And in my experience, I've thought quite a lot about it, like in various activist groups that I'm a part of, and having to use like more secure connections for like event planning and things like that. But for the majority of like social media users, especially my age, it doesn't even occur to them. And I think that's kind of part of a privilege of living in New Zealand, is that we can say what we want online without real consequences. So yeah, I don't have much of an answer to that, other than to say I don't think most people think about it.
Yeah, I think exactly what Dante said. Privacy within social media is somewhat overlooked in our generation, and probably in general. And I think, yeah, what I do is I use more encrypted platforms if I have to say something that I wouldn't really want to get out. But I think that what needs to be done, or what needs to be discussed, is what steps is the government or these platform creators taking to make users feel more safe on these platforms. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
I think you guys covered that pretty well.
We have another question from the audience.
Hi, thanks very much. My question is about the general, one of the big themes of this conference has been about polarization and the effect of social media in creating polarization. And I wonder if you've seen much of that amongst your own communities. Do young people get polarized by social media, and what groups, if any, are they falling into? Or has it not happened? I don't know.
Well, one similar thing which I've definitely seen happen on social media is like the content's kind of getting taken out of proportion. So not necessarily, I'm not thinking like big political issues. I'm more thinking like friendship things on a group chat. But I guess it's the same principle applied, is that people just aren't listening to the other person because they're kind of, something's getting lost in translation. So I guess there's kind of a link between those two things.
Yeah, again, and like not in particularly in political things, though the same thing does apply. In more of like social justice, I guess, circles, there's been a massive trend recently of what's called cancel culture. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of that, where if like an online creator or influencer or a celebrity has done something wrong, they become cancelled, which means that like it's basically a way of saying that whatever they do from now doesn't matter and they are a bad person. In fandoms online, which are a big part of social media that are often overlooked, where people get very attached to like, you know, works of fiction and like the fandoms that surround those fictions, and that causes a lot of like intense polarizing discussion where if you disagree with me, you're a bad person, even if you're arguing about like an episode of Star Trek. But yeah, and I think that does carry over into like as people grow up into like the world of politics, because it becomes a similar thing. So at least that's what I think.
I think you guys.
Is it not coming up? It's coming up.
We have a.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Cheers.
Thank you, and thank you all so much for your comments. It's been really interesting and just such a great perspective to bring into these 2 days. So thank you all for being here and sharing your thoughts. My question actually goes to the platform piece. I'm here from Microsoft, so it's grateful to hear a reference to Excel. But I was really interested in some of the comments you've been making through the questions about the platform responsibility piece, and so I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about what you think the platforms could be doing better to create some of those safer spaces and communities, and actually if there are any examples of where you're seeing it done really well.
Yeah, I think interesting question. Yeah, I'm not sure if there is much that. I think there have been a lot of studies done on this, and I think there's a lot of academic work in that area, and I think that work's really valuable and should definitely be looked at. But I think it needs to be integrated with talking to youth about their experiences. So, I mean, partly as a side note, I'd like to say thank you for inviting us here. And I remember looking at like the agenda and like the guest list and having a moment of being like, wow, I'm so unqualified to be here. But I think it is important to like create spaces where youth can talk about their experiences, and you base your like rules and regulations and your way forward on lived-in experiences and of the stories people tell you about what they've done. I can't think of any specific examples right now, but I'm sure if you like go out there in the world and chat to some youth, you'd find plenty of things that come up regularly, and like plenty of youth would actually have like ideas as to how to solve that. It's just it doesn't occur to them to tell anyone because they don't really think their views on it are going to be regarded as anything.
Yeah, and building off of that, make it accessible for youth to put in these submissions. You know, like, don't get us to read like a 200-page report and then talk to you about it. Make it accessible and engaging, and acknowledge that our perspective, although sometimes we feel unqualified, are really important for the way we move forward, because we'll be the ones paving the way forward, and our opinions matter, and making sure that our opinions are able to be shared in an accessible way, that you can get a broad variety of views, like putting out surveys works, but also like talking to people, making personal connections to get these anecdotes, to get these conversations going, is that's what I'd suggest.
Yeah, I'd also just like to add, I think, one part of it is like the platforms themselves, but it's also about how can kind of young people kind of use it in their everyday lives and how can they do it in a way that isn't as disruptive as possible, you know? Like I can see in a couple of my lectures, you know, person 2 rows and me just scrolling through Instagram the entire time. And, you know, they should really be picking up those economic principles, not looking at their friends on Instagram. So, like, I think that's the other side of it as well, is that once, like, the platforms have got their kind of structure of the app, how can it actually be, you know, usable for young people in a way, well, not just young people, everyone actually, so that it can be used for good and not in a way that actually gets in the way of their everyday life. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more. And
We've got time. We've got 10 minutes more. Sorry, Paul. I wanted to ask Paul, with regards to what was just said on the panel, is there any way in which the call is reaching out to young people and getting their input around what the call should be doing in the future?
Can I, while you think, Paul, can I ask him, do you know what he's referring to, the call, the Christchurch call?
Vaguely.
Have you heard, who's heard of the Christchurch call? Okay. They're asking us to elaborate because they missed your session earlier.
That's great. I think that actually answers the same way I was
your
going
question,
which is to say inadequately. It's been great hearing those perspectives, and it's prompted me to think a bit more about the demographics that we connect with in the call and how the advisory network works well. I mean, one of the things listening to your comments earlier that sprung to my mind is Susan Benesh's comments yesterday about the challenge not so much of the dangerous speech that finds its way onto the internet, but how you work at the other end, those that actually are on the receiving end of it and how they respond to it. And I think that there's a really important voice there for us in the Christchurch Call work, for instance, of hearing from younger folk who often are those that right-wing extremists or violent extremists are looking to connect with, partly because of the energy that you bring to your online engagement. And it'd be really helpful for us actually to be able to bring more of that in. For what it's worth, I'm happy to talk about the Christchurch Call with you after this, if that works, and take you through what it's about. But it's fundamentally about trying to deal with terrorist and violent extremist content online in the wake of what we saw after the Christchurch attacks, and do that in a participatory manner. Obviously, we've missed a trick, I think.
I wanted to pick up also, you know, you talked about people sort of falling into, you know, right wing, which would make me think you're probably, and that was not a good thing, which makes me think we're probably talking more to the progressive left wing here. So how can we expand that discourse? I mean, what concerns you about a right wing, perhaps social media presence or involvement with your peers?
Right. When I say right wing, I mean the really radical right. Because, frankly, I feel unsafe a lot of the time with what I see certain agendas on social media that, like hate speech and stuff like that. Being a queer brown person, it's scary, you know, that it's so accessible to get this information. And so that's mainly what I'm talking about. I'm more towards the left, I guess, definitely. But yeah, no, just that information, because it's so easy to click on a post and then click on another post, and then the algorithm does its thing, and now you're in an echo chamber of why you should hate these people because of this, and why these people should die, and then people live stream things, and things happen in real life, and it's not just on social media, and that's a really big issue. And I think that making sure that those algorithms stop working like that would be the first part, but also education outside of social media to make people not post things like that, and to make it so that young people know, hey, this isn't the road to go down. You know, like, hey, hate speech isn't actually okay. It's not freedom of speech to be talking about how you want to kill someone or how you want to hate crime someone. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And from like a political standpoint, I think, again, echo chambers. I don't feel like I'm a very good representation of a lot of youth politically, because I am quite politically involved and quite left. I'm a volunteer for the Green Party. And I think it would be really important to like reach out to youth on all of the sides of the political spectrum. We often see like, well, there's a stereotype, and I'm not sure how much it is based in fact, that violent extremists online tend to be more right-leaning politically. I'm not sure how true that is, but that's just the stereotype we have. And I think it's important to reach out to youth that are involved in like those areas and talk to them about why they're involved in those areas. And I think something we can learn from social media and from online culture is that playing the blame game isn't going to help anyone. And yeah, I don't know, that kind of thing.
Thank you. And you know, my concern here, even as organizers, is are we somehow inadvertently creating echo chambers because we, you know, are gathering? How do we avoid sort of contributing to those things? How do we bring those perspectives in ways that are respectful, but also affirm the...
I think that was really well covered, yeah.
Just like quickly answering that, make it accessible, you know, like not everyone can take time off school to get their way to the university to be on a panel for an hour. Not everyone has the ability or the time or the energy or the capacity, and I think that that really needs to be looked at, that Dante and I and Alexi, we're really privileged to be here, and so we're talking off of a really privileged perspective in that manner, and making sure that you realize your own privilege to be in this room, you know? Like, a lot of you must have come out of town, and you all have valuable perspectives, but what also matters are the perspectives that aren't here. You know, like, what are they thinking? What are they saying? Take the actual, use your privilege to make the work to take those steps to get those other perspectives. Yeah.
Also, I'm just going to briefly interject. When it comes to like echo chambers and giving people like a voice to like voice their opinions, I'd say situations like this are actually really good places to have like more extremist views, because academic conferences can be like sometimes generally counted on to be pretty calm affairs.
Echo chamber?
A fun echo there, thanks. And places of like intellectual conversation about extremist ideas are a far better place for ideas than, like, for example, social media. But I feel like a lot of extremists are like very obviously and validly dismissed in academic circles, so they turn to social media. And it's like the analogy that's always used about freedom of speech, about how it's one thing to like sit down at a dinner table and discuss the prices of corn, and it's the other thing to like stand in front of an angry crowd blaming the corn farmers. And I think social media has become the angry crowd, and we need to stop the people, like, you know, give people a space to speak that isn't in front of the crowd, an angry crowd.
Oh yeah, just a quick comment. It's really cool with things, I guess, like Zoom, if that's one thing that's come out of COVID, that it can really, I guess, bring the conference to everyone. So I guess it's just a question of how can you use it even further to bring even more people to hear kind of the perspectives of what people have to say.
Paul has another
You
question.
have Paul? Oh, sorry, hang on, Paul. Yeah, just for the Zoom, you'll need the mic. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Sanjana. Just coming back to the angry crowd question, from your experience as young people, to what extent are we focusing on the angry crowd more than we are on the good things that social media might deliver for you? Because I've heard about a lot of the positive aspects here. How do you feel about that balance, and what would be your suggestions about how we work with the angry crowd problem? Coming to your point about not just blaming, how do we focus on that, the good bits, such as they are, and what can be done to reinforce that around, say, digital inclusion and other tools for you?
I'd say it would be like a many-faceted thing, clearly because it's such a complex issue. I think a few things that could help would be to not dismiss the emotion of the crowd. I think it's another reason why words like dismissive came to the forefront in so many conversations I had with my friends before the seminar, is that online a lot of emotions get stirred up, and often those emotions are dismissed because it's online, and everything in the online arena is lesser than real interactions. So I think addressing the emotional intensity that occurs online, both in the negative sphere and positively, and I think also, addressing the crowd as individual people and processing that everyone's coming to this crowd with a different perspective and a different reason to be there, but they're being united by this. So thinking about things as individual, highly emotional situations. And I do think too much emphasis is put on the negative effects of social media when it comes to emotional stirring. I think I've seen really great things come from emotional speeches and projects that for example, YouTube influencers who raise millions of dollars for charities by doing live streams where they play games and talk to people who have been affected by that. That's emotion. That's pulling together a crowd in an emotional way, but it's to do amazing positive change, and that doesn't get talked about that much. So.
Thank you, and we need to wrap up. Our time is rapidly drawing to an end, but we're really so thankful and grateful, yes, for you two also to leave school, to be with us today. For Alexi also, you're still in school because this university is your school. So, and let's just give them a round of applause.
Yeah. 15 minutes, 2:15. We meet back at 2:15.
Okay, so we have a 15-minute tea break, and then we will be back in for nearing our final session. Thank you.
issues that are going to be front door issues very quickly. And I'll tell you how quickly these things change. Just over lunch, that's the only change in terms of time. Otherwise, the constitution of the panel remains the same. And I hope Kara is with us. Is she? Tom? Oh, hey. Hey, Kara. Thanks for accommodating the shift in time. Thankfully, you're not too far away across the Tasman. The mistake was entirely mine, and I appreciate you shifting your schedule to come and join us 45 minutes earlier. I don't know how much Kara and the people joining for this session over Zoom have been attentive to what has been an incredibly rich 2 days. This is the final session. We had a fantastic session just before this with youth. I think for many in the room, it was the highlight of the 2 days. And in addition to that, we've had some rich discussions over some really complex issues, and we've covered a lot of terrain as well. So what I thought the final session would do or could do is, with the help of colleagues, both here in the room and Kara, you, to have a forward-looking perspective. Of course, looking at what ails us today, but also to look at what is going to come at us and what can be done. So frontier issues that are going to be front door issues very quickly. And I'll tell you how quickly these things change. Just over lunch, as I've shared with a few of you, at least lunch here in New Zealand, might be a different time for the people on Zoom, Facebook has released a significant document and policy guidance for the company, embracing, in a manner that it has never in its corporate history, has human rights as a core business operating principle. I haven't read the document, but I am privileged to know the individual who heads human rights at Facebook, Miranda, who's a wonderful individual. I've known her for over 15 years. And it is that trust I place in her, even with all of the failings of the company, that one can look forward to with some optimism that this document will be enacted in full, and it's not just something that is printed or published for cosmetic purposes. And as I understand it, Alex Borovka, you might be listening in, thank you for working with Miranda on this. So just to give a sense in the room that these things change very, very quickly in the course of the conference as well. Did you guys talk about an order of preference? We will, Kara, go as we've always done for the past 2 days. I will not introduce any one of you. Safe to say that as it has always been, it is also a privilege to have the both of you here. Kim, I was privileged to kind of be on a shared platform last year with the University of Canterbury on groupthink. Nicole, thank you for coming down to Dunners. And Kara, thank you for joining us from Aussie. So do you want to go first? Or maybe leave Kara last, and one of you go first, if you don't mind, Kara. Okay. Take a mic, and I think, Tom, we can get Nicole's presentation on screen.
Gonna need a clicker.
Yes, we have a clicker too, actually. Where is the clicker? Oh, the clicker is here. Sorry. There you go.
So I thought I would just start by going through a few little things around misinformation. I've heard a lot about misinformation and disinformation today. I haven't heard about malinformation today or yesterday, so I thought I'd touch on that.
Yep.
And then work through what the kind of regulatory landscape that I work in is, and then look forward to what we could possibly start to do, and I'll just give one example because there's so many and I've got so little time, about what New Zealand could possibly do to help inoculate future infodemics from occurring. So in a regulatory environment, sorry, two different things to go. In a regulatory environment, really important to be able to understand the nuances of different types of misinformation. So I just wanted to make clear that misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and the spectrum of which those different elements form together, and how we may go about assessing what kind of information we're dealing with when it comes to conspiracy theories, extremism, and things like that. So it's a very, very nuanced environment, and these are the kind of details that we kind of look for to try and understand them, how we might try to build frameworks towards dealing with them, and really trying to make not just government, but everybody else understand how that environment really converges together when it comes to social and online particularly, but also we see these off-world impacts as well at protests and things like that.
Shall I move that forward for you? Is that it?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
Not enough hands. So one of the big points around the different types of misinformation is just how participatory, really tongue twister there, that is for communications and for communities. So we observe what's happening in those spaces. We have that emotional response, which I heard Maria talking about yesterday, and I've heard a couple of speakers also touch on that today. We share that, and that's certainly something we just heard from the youth that came to speak to us. And often we also search for like information. And this sort of goes around in this nice little echo chamber circle, and it becomes quite a vicious little echo chamber for everybody online, and it can have those offline impacts as well. So why do we participate, I think, is a really important question from a communications perspective as well. So we're consuming the information, but we're also communicating it outward as well once we've consumed it. So online in particular, content's delivered in a way that users consume it really, really quickly. We've all got really short attention spans. And we don't allow ourselves enough time to mentally process the information that's coming in. So our brains sort of have a little shortcut happening in there, so that when content is delivered in those little nudges, whether it's to buy something, to vote on something, to find out more about a piece of information, our brains sort of kick into gear and find those shortcuts, hook into the emotions, and that starts to shape our perceptions. And of course, the algorithms are working in the background to also serve us more of the content that we like and engage with. Very few internet users also know how those algorithms work. Really, really pleasing to find an audience yesterday and today. Everyone's really onto it. But when we talk to people about algorithms, they're kind of not really sure about what they do and how they work. Advertising is probably the best and clearest example that we can use to convey that information. So they don't understand why they keep seeing the information that they already like and share. And once they're in that echo chamber, it becomes really difficult for some of them to get out. They don't know how to break free, how to retrain the algorithm, how to get out and make a new little echo chamber for themselves that may be a bit more healthier, a bit more safe. So New Zealand has been an absolute model of great pandemic management, but we can't become complacent in the information space. Already we've seen scams and voting kind of frauds offering people, give us $49 and we'll give you a vaccine and all those kind of things popping up in New Zealand. We've seen social media content promoting the idea that the vaccine is a population control method, particularly in minority communities. We've already talked about this a few times, I think, certainly on our table, that the vaccine contains nanoparticles. Bill Gates is in there microchipping everybody. And they have DNA altering factors. And that's really converging with 5G, which 5G is now activating those little nanoparticles, and that's how we're all going to turn into robots. So a real convergence of different conspiracy theories, a real convergence of different types of misinformation. And it's important, sort of, if you kind of think back to those three different types of misinformation, it's not just everyday people believing different things that generate this stuff. It can also be nation states. Certainly in Europe, they're seeing a lot of sort of like soft power push in, if I could put it that way, into some of the Nordic countries in particular around vaccine, the different types of vaccines on offer in those countries and how the Russian vaccine is better, for example. So it's not just a grassroots movement thing, it's not just a conspiracy theorist thing, it can be at a quite high level as well. I think it's really important to remember that. So what do we have currently in our toolkit in New Zealand? We recognise well and truly that online harms and crimes are global and our response needs to be global as well. But we need to protect everybody within our borders and beyond. We have the Unsolicited Electronic Messages Act and the Harmful Digital Messaging Act, as well as the Office and Film Classification Literature, which we work closely with in DIA in sorting out some of the content that appears. We're also sending to the Budapest Convention, which is really, really important on an international scale. So that's going to generate a lot more discussion within New Zealand and how we go about delivering some of those more practical aspects of the convention. And then we're kind of looking future focused as well. So we want to think about the challenges that we see today, the challenges we're going to see coming, and that includes a wider media review by DIA policy that I was encouraged to mention. So what can we do to learn, and where can we go for a bit of a hat tip around how do we manage this kind of stuff? Where around the world is doing this really well? Russia, and in my work with NATO, you know, they're also very, very concerned about Russia. We don't have those kind of geopolitical challenges, I guess, down here. But certainly when we think of Europe, they've been dealing with this infodemic from vaccines to politics to pretty much any kind of topic or context you can think of for generations. So the different countries have built different ways to deal with that. Finland's a really, really good example. You might think, what's Finland and New Zealand got in common? Quite a few things, actually. Both teams of 5+ million-ish, both led by very capable prime ministers. Sort of a very comparable land size as well. Small, independent democracies. And we have a lot of shared similar views and values, which is really important. Finland starts their training for children in the education system around how to spot disinformation, malinformation, misinformation at the age of 6. So that's quite profound in terms of the level of discussions they're having in an age-appropriate way. So they evaluate, they fact-check, they're taught to find sources in a really academic kind of educational approach. They learn in art how to look at digital images, how to Photoshop, what a Photoshopped image looks like, what an AI-generated image may look like. And in science, they talk about vaccine disinformation, and they put some of the conspiracy theories to the test. So that's just a few of the things that I wanted to touch on, and what we can draw out of that Finland example, and it's just one example because there are so many that we could draw from. So the big keys for New Zealand would be we can't regulate or legislate our way out of an infodemic. Online media can be the fuel to the social media fire, and we really need to continue to work with big tech on a safety by design approach. Building sovereign resilience is really, really important, and we need to do that before we need it. We can't wait until after it's become a massive problem. I come from Australia. Murdoch media, there's a lot of conspiracy theories happening, gets a lot of amplification, for example. So trying to build that now in that kind of context becomes really, really problematic. So building it before you need it is really, really important. And that is where I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Kim?
Kia ora koutou. I'm Kim Connolly-Stone, and I'm the Policy Director for Internet New Zealand. And For those of you who don't know about Internet New Zealand, we're a little NGO and we run the domain name space for .nz. And put it horribly simply, you know, when you're trying to find a website or an email address that ends in .nz, we do that magic. We also have a public good side, and we like to kind of weigh in on policy issues and legal issues that affect the internet. Our byline is that we're about an internet for all and an internet for good, you know, because the internet really is awesome, and it's been getting a little bit of a bad harness the power of that internet and making sure that all of us, if we want to, can make the most of this increasingly digital world. And we're also about this thing that we describe as an internet for good, and this is a little bit of an evolution of our thinking on what it means to advocate for a free and an open internet. And I think we're just all conscious, you know, in the wake of the Christchurch terror attacks, that we kind of needed to reflect more openly about the bad things that can happen on the internet, as well as the amazing stuff that it helps us do. You know, so for Internet for Good is about acknowledging that the internet, it can be better for us as individuals, for our communities, and for the whole world in general. And all this misinformation online, that's not an internet for good, and that's why we wanted to be part of the conversation today. So the big question for this session is, if these information disorders are inevitably going to be a thing, how do we protect ourselves? And we think at Internet New Zealand, the high-level answer, or the prescription, is to take a community approach, and that we need to work across the whole community to deal with the spread of these harmful infodemics.
So the mic closer?
Oh,
Okay.
sorry. It is so heavy, this microphone. And we reckon there are 5 things that need to be considered when we take this community prescription. And I think these 5 things summarise a lot of the things that we've been talking about over the last couple of days. So the first thing is we need to be clear about what we're talking about. And we've very helpfully just had a slide that, you know, talks about misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. And these are all very different things. And when you're thinking about how you might want to weigh in and deal with some of that, you need to think about which of those that you're focusing on. Because, you know, issues like election integrity, COVID-19, or whether Paul McCartney died in 1966, they're not equal. The response is going to depend on the problem that we're looking at. And as others have pointed out over the last couple of days, you know, spreading of misinformation isn't that underlying problem, but it certainly contributes to it. And those underlying problems are around, you know, the trust in the accurate or the authoritative sources is waning, and belief in dangerous mistruth or conspiracy theories, you know, is costing lives and affecting our democracies. But the deal is, if we can understand those underlying problems, then we start to open up the avenues for the community-centred solutions. So this brings me to point 2 of 5 points, and this is about evidence. So we actually need to have, you know, evidence and information about what's actually going on here in New Zealand. How are New Zealanders experiencing the internet and these misinformation issues? Because if we don't understand what experiences people are having, how do we know where to look, you know, if we want to do something about this? And there are some organisations in the NGO world offering to help government do this, but, you know, getting the funding support is really challenging. And one of the difficulties for NGOs working in this area is knowing who in government to go to, like, oh, who are the people we should go public good side, and we like to kind of weigh in on policy issues and legal issues that affect the internet. Our byline is that we're about an internet for all and an internet for good, because the internet really is awesome, and it's been getting a little bit of a bad rap over the past day. By internet for all, it's about helping New Zealanders harness the power of that internet and making sure that all of us, if we want to, can make the most of this increasingly digital world. And we're also about this thing that we describe as an internet for good. And this is a little bit of an evolution of our thinking, of what it means to advocate for a free and an open internet. And I think we're just all conscious, in the wake of the Christchurch terror attacks, that we kind of needed to reflect more openly about the bad things that can happen on the internet, as well as the amazing stuff that it helps us do. So for Internet for Good is about acknowledging that the internet, it can be better for us as individuals, for our communities, and for the whole world in general. And all this misinformation online, that's not an internet for good, and that's why we wanted to be part of the conversation today. So the big question for this session is, if these information disorders are inevitably going to be a thing, how do we protect ourselves? And we think at Internet New Zealand, the high-level answer, or the prescription, is to take a community approach, and that we need to work across the whole community to deal with the spread of these harmful infodemics.
So the mic closer?
Oh,
Okay.
sorry. It is so heavy, this microphone. And we reckon there are 5 things that need to be considered when we take this community prescription. And I think these 5 things summarise a lot of the things that we've been talking about over the last couple of days. So the first thing is we need to be clear about what we're talking about. And we've very helpfully just had a slide that talks about misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. And these are all very different things. And when you're thinking about how you might want to weigh in and deal with some of that, you need to think about which of those that you're focusing on. Because issues like election integrity, COVID-19, or whether Paul McCartney died in 1966, they're not equal. The response is going to depend on the problem that we're looking at. And as others have pointed out over the last couple of days, spreading of misinformation isn't that underlying problem, but it certainly contributes to it. And those underlying problems are around, the trust in the accurate or the authoritative sources is waning, and belief in dangerous mistruth or conspiracy theories is costing lives and affecting our democracies. But the deal is, if we can understand those underlying problems, then we start to open up the avenues for the community-centred solutions. So this brings me to point 2 of 5 points, and this is about evidence. So we actually need to have evidence and information about what's actually going on here in New Zealand. How are New Zealanders experiencing the internet and these misinformation issues? Because if we don't understand what experiences people are having, how do we know where to look, if we want to do something about this? And there are some organisations in the NGO world offering to help government do this. But getting the funding support is really challenging. And one of the difficulties for NGOs working in this area is knowing who in government to go to. Who are the people we should go chat to about misinformation? And sometimes these things can fall between the cracks. So that's something we could look to make a little easier for those who want to help out with this. The third part of the community prescription is that we do need some systemic, across-the-board responses to the misinformation challenges, in addition to also taking some individual responsibility. And there's a few systems that we could take a look at. The first one is the technical systems, the ones that can track and break the chains of trends. Content isn't the only remedy. So yesterday, Twitter talked about, the processes they've got to flag content and reduce its amplification. But while it's really great that platforms are starting to build these systems, Many of them, though, aren't providing enough visibility about their design and how they work, or transparency on how they make decisions. And I think a lot of us have been talking about there's room for improvement there, so that can be part of the prescription as well. The second set of systems we can think about to help us solve this, work our way through, are legal systems. There are levers in a lot of areas that governments might want to look at. Laws on competition, laws on privacy, laws on data protection, media laws. Yesterday we heard there were a lot of concerns about the business models of some of the big platforms. If we were up for dealing with that, maybe we could look at a competition law response. People have been talking about, do we split up these bigger platforms? Do we have a look at privacy and data protection laws? Those would actually change the business models. Less monetizing of ourselves, maybe. Let me say I'm not proposing this, but I'm just saying this is an area to consider. And then sort of after, the legal systems, the tech systems, also, there's supporting individuals with the critical thinking, with the digital skills and inclusion, bringing in more public interest media, all part of the mix. But as others have said, these will have some limited impacts if we're not also looking, at those underlying issues. So the fourth thing then in this prescription is we need to have everybody working together to address misinformation issues, and others have talked about this over the last few days as well. So this includes our community groups, our tech companies, our governments, and experts. And there are some really great examples where we can see a lot of engagement going on between the larger tech companies and with governments. But community organisations or community voices, youth voices, as we've just heard, aren't usually part of the conversation, although sometimes they are. But I think we need to see more of that. And what do we mean by community? There's quite a few elements. There is the technical community who care and know about the internet and have got reckons on some of this stuff, so we can invite them into the conversation. There's civil society groups who care about human rights. There are organisations who are in their communities, perhaps representing minority voices, and then there's actually the people in the community as well. So there's scope to tap in at all of those levels. And then we can think about, governments and what can their role be with community. And we think it's one of support. And in particular, what we'd like to propose here for part of the prescription is government funding communities to figure out what the solutions might be that would work for them. And don't go tagging that money for particular things. Actually say, here's some funding for community to think about misinformation issues in their community. And then industry can also do more to reach out to community when developing new systems, new features, or industry codes. And speaking of codes, I'm not sure if anyone has clocked the new Australian Misinformation Code, developed by Digi, which is the industry group for the tech sector in Australia.
Kim, sorry, just because we have a hard stop with the people getting a flight, so
Sure.
Final point.
Final point.
Yeah.
Okay, but we reckon that's not going to work because that is not a systemic thing. And this community empowerment is just really important because it's the thing that's going to bring trust. But the fifth thing to remember then simply is misinformation is connected to other things. And this is especially the case with regulation. Solutions you have for one thing might break other things. So an Australian new law to get more cash into the pockets of publishers might actually push us more down the track of misinformation as folks are going to get shut out of the social media place where they go and get their news. And the New Zealand government is about to tackle this media review. It's part of its solution for the Christchurch call issues. So it's really important that the government have a think about first principles. How could you use this review to really understand the information systems in New Zealand, where people go for that information, and how best might we regulate that?
Thank you, Kim. Cara, 10 minutes, if you don't mind.
No problem, Sanj, and I'm happy to keep it short so that we can throw to questions and a bit of Q&A amongst the panel, given the time limitations. But quickly, kia ora, my name is Cara Hinesley, Director of Public Policy for Australia and New Zealand at Twitter, as well as the steward for our Data for Good program. which we're very proud to partner with the University of Otago and NCPACS on. I just want to say thank you, Nicole and Kim. I found that very informative, very informational. I appreciated the presentations and the community-led approach. I would agree with many of your points, and I would say that all of us on this panel actually agree on the idea that we need to have shared definitions. We need to have shared terminology. And with that foundation, I think we'll be able to build quite strong collaborative approaches cross-functionally and across government, industry, civil society, and NGOs. In terms of a Twitter perspective, I know that you've heard from our amazing lead, Vijay, and Kathleen yesterday, and so I won't go into too much detail off the top, just to ensure that we can, again, save some time for discussion. But some of the things that I would just flag that's been raised, especially around co-regulatory and self-regulatory approaches, especially in relation to the Australian Disinformation and Misinformation Code, the Voluntary Industry Code that we recently enacted. One of the key things that we're really working towards, again, with this code is to have a consistent threshold and baseline amongst a number of different companies that offer a vast variety of services, everything from news aggregation services and actual publishers to social media companies to cloud service providers. We have a number of companies that have all publicly signed on to this, and I think the idea we're trying to ensure is not only are there thresholds, but also there's a level of transparency with annual reports, so that people are able to understand not only where policies are with respective companies, but also how those policies are being enforced and what kind of impacts we're seeing from those enforcement measures. So it's a huge step in the right direction. We always say this work is never done, and we're always trying to meet the evolutions and changing contours of conversation. But that's a code that I think is something that is leading the way in the way that we're looking at misinformation, disinformation together, and also how are we going to tackle some of these larger issues around big current events, civic integrity, election processes, and the like. The other thing I would just quickly note too is experimentation. I think that's something that Twitter is trying to work on out in the open much, much more. And I think when we talk about industry and tech companies coming to the table, one of the things that we also want to work with trusted partners, but also have the people that use our service help us understand is what is working and what is not. And that's through experimenting with the product, with policies, as we go and as we come up against new problems or new changes in the way that people are interacting together in online spaces. I know, for instance, we've been trying out a number of different experiments, whether it's prompting people when we think that they might be tweeting something that would upset another person, to rolling out the read before you retweet prompt, which is encouraging people to actually click through to articles before they retweet the content. We actually found that when we've been running this experiment for a couple months, and we actually found out that 40% more people were reading the article after seeing the prompt than without the prompt. And so it's these kinds of stats that are helping us, again, inform what approach should we have? How should we be able to work with people to stem misinformation and disinformation, but also to really allow that space for freedom of expression and conversation in the public realm? Our CEO, Jack, and co-founder has always said that the best parts of Twitter actually come from the people that use it. And so we're trying to really lead with people in mind, the user at the forefront, and then seeing how we make these different changes and if they actually work and achieve their intended objectives. So that's probably the last point I'll just quickly make. And let's hand over to you, Sanj, so that we can chat a little bit more about this important topic.
Yeah, thanks, Cara. Thanks for that perspective. And thank you to all the three speakers for presenting. Listen, this is pretty much for an Aotearoa New Zealand conversation, really. If you take a look at the agenda, it is very much what Aotearoa New Zealand wants to present as the best practices for governance and government and oversight and regulatory and legal mechanisms and frameworks moving forward around information disorders. but it is also for perhaps people in the room to kind of put up red flags around anything that was proposed as a way in which these can be addressed. We have several senior policymakers in the room. I don't know who's on Zoom, but this is pretty much your opportunity to kind of question the presenters. Anybody in the room wants to take a crack? Yeah, Jeremy.
Hi there. Thanks very much. I guess this is a question for everyone, but it occurred to me when I was listening to Cara. So you talked about the product and experimenting with the product, and you also talked about interacting with governments and collaborating with governments. Do you think that there's any room for the product looking different for different governments, or do you want to roll out the same product across the world?
Thanks for the question. I would say in relation to having a different product for different governments, I would be extremely concerned that if we start to go down that route, that we are going to actually further fracture any sort of shared realities that we have online, and not only lead to a further splinternet or balkanization of the internet into kind of walled gardens, but also start to really have an unequal or uneven sort of experience for everybody on the platform. One of the key things and principles that Twitter has upheld since its inception is the idea of an open public conversation. And our platform is very different from a lot of other social media or tech companies in the fact that by default, we're public and it's all in real time. And so you're able to speak in this conversational sort of way with people around the world, whether you actually know them or not. And it's based on a follow model instead of a friend model, which is a bit different in terms of, you know, again, expanding out your networks and expanding out folks that would be part of the conversation versus your kind of friends and family and people that you already know. So I would be worried that if we, again, go down that route, especially knowing other areas and governments that we're currently dealing with. I think our senior director, Kathleen Reen, mentioned some of the concerns around you'd most recently seen in Russia, where we're being throttled and being slowed down in terms of the actual platform being able to operate on the internet. You know, this is something we've also seen internet shutdowns in Myanmar as everything is taking place there. And so that would, I think, open the door for a lot of authoritarian governments and areas where we're seeing freedom of speech and dissent being quashed by government. I think that that would just be an open door to actually further kind of enshrine that in the platform and the internet, which would be antithetical to the way that we're trying to look at having a global public conversation and preserve the open internet as a company.
Do you have any response? No. Okay. I just wanted to play. I mean, you can please feel free. It's directed at Cara, but perhaps in the room as well. Cara, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, was very gracious in sending us an opening statement. And of course, what she articulated has been articulated by other speakers in over the 2 days as well. And one of the points was around algorithmic transparency, but also algorithmic harms and, you know, the rabbit holes and whatnot. And this entire set of issues around algorithms. And I don't think that this is an issue that's going to go away. And so there's varying understandings of what an algorithm is. But, you know, just to riff off the point that you made about the product being and not being different to different people, you know, there is an argument to be made that, you know, the products are different things to different people based on their geographic location or the language that they kind of primarily use the product in, and how the algorithm kind of shapes their user experience. And also the degree to which, I suppose, language localization plays a role in user intervention and user feedback reporting as well. So around this whole business, I mean, I think there had been some statements made on Analyst Day by Twitter around giving the user more control about algorithms. But I don't want it to be just about Twitter. What do you see as the future of algorithms in our information order, in our information ecosystem, I suppose is a larger systemic question I wanted to ask. It plays as much a role in Sri Lanka as it does in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So given that there is so much suspicion, doubt, fear, anxiety over this phrase or idea or term or technology, how do you see that playing out 2021 and beyond? And maybe that's a question for the two of you as well. Carla, you can take a crack at that, and then I can get Kim and Nicole to
All right, I'll take a quick crack, and then I would be happy to hand over to the amazing women on the panel. In terms of the way that we're looking at algorithms, I would just quickly note from a Twitter perspective that algorithms operate very differently on our platform than they do on other company platforms. We have the option actually of if you're in the app, if you look in the top right-hand corner, there's a little button, we call it swish. It looks like a sparkle icon, but essentially it turns off the algorithm on the timeline. So people are able to turn that on and off as they wish. And it goes back to a pure reverse chronological timeline, which means the most recent thing that was tweeted is up at the top and so on. So it's something that we haven't really ingrained into our product quite the same way as we've seen in perhaps other social media platforms or tech company platforms. What I would say, though, is as we're looking at this, I think we'd all agree that algorithmic transparency is incredibly important and a place that we need to move towards. One of the ideas that, like on Analyst Day, you mentioned our CEO, Jack Dorsey, has spoken about before and is looking at very strategically is the idea of almost like an algorithm app marketplace. But basically the idea that people would be able to choose their own algorithms and they would understand what it does, what it's surfacing, how it works, and people would have algorithmic choice in terms of what they're applying. So some of the options would be maybe to, be able to filter out certain spam or certain content that you don't want to see, or to promote up, things that you really do like video games or movies or something, or just conversations from people you follow. Like there's a lot of different options and they're currently investigating how it'll work. But the idea about algorithmic choice is something that we feel very passionately about and will be trying to move towards in the coming months and years.
Did you have any thoughts on that or anything else, Kim, frankly?
Algorithmic transparency, absolutely, yes, let's have some more of that. And as you say, it's not as simple as some would imagine. But there are some amazing technologists in civil society, I think, who we could definitely would be able to, if a tech firm opened the can on an algorithm, could have a little look at that on behalf of the rest of us. And can we do more to, in a plain English way, explain to the users of the platforms how these algorithms are working? It doesn't just have to be, hello, look at my algorithm. And Kara's comments just now about having a little more algorithmic choice, if you like. I know as a user, I would definitely love to be able to, say what I'm after, what I want to see, to kind of say, this is my profile, this is how to treat me. And if we could head in that direction, that would be a great direction to go in. And also just in New Zealand, a little plug, for the work that Stats has been doing around algorithmic transparency in government. That's a nice...
Could you explain that for the people on Zoom, maybe, who might not be familiar with what...
I wonder if someone from government in the audience might want to explain that. I'd hate to kind of speak on behalf of.
Everybody from government is looking very shy at the moment.
Yeah.
Paul, maybe just very quickly, because people on Zoom might not be familiar.
Sure. The New Zealand government, through its Department of Statistics, recently published the first algorithmic charter, or algorithm charter, which sets out a set of principles for the way the government will use algorithms when processing data that belongs to citizens and is in its care. That puts a number of principles underneath that data around accessibility, explainability, ethical use, upholding things like the Privacy Act, etc., and commits to ensuring that those algorithms are regularly reviewed as well. It's a bit of a first. Signed up to by about 60 or 70% of government departments at the moment, and more coming on board as they understand more about what it means. Hopefully that's about right, Kim.
I would agree with my co-panelist and what Paul said. And I think it's important to realise that our understanding, and certainly what the public who know about algorithms, what their view of it is very much based on behavioural advertising. So it's a for-profit geared algorithm. So if you can program an algorithm to do that, you can program an algorithm to do other things like deliver services, holistic nudges, all those kind of things. So I think the potential for the future is very much balancing out those human rights issues, those privacy issues, those civil libertarian issues, with how you want to be treated online. My only hesitation around sort of building your own algorithm, or this is the information I want to see, that kind of thing, I can easily sort of see how, when we talk about radicalization, for example, you just go further and further and further down that rabbit hole without any kind of checks and balances or interjection of fresh information, which could become really, really scary.
Yeah. It's the classic definition of a wicked problem. We have David first, and then Nicola. Sorry. Maybe we can take both questions, actually.
Kia ora, and thank you for another fascinating presentation. I just want to open up something that has been bothering me for a little while. And there's a great introduction, Nicole, that I think you provided to it in terms of mentioning that there's a broad media regulatory review underway. And that went by so fast, a lot of people in the room might have missed it. But actually that is the potential for a very substantive review of media regulation, including social media regulation in this country, including potentially, I guess, algorithmic transparency and requirements like that. You also mentioned the work around Budapest Convention implementation. Kim, I think you reacted to the reference to legislation by referring to the CVE bill that's currently before the House. We've heard about initiatives about to be launched in relation to the Christchurch Call, further evolutions of that. We've got, of course, the Royal Commission report, which has 44 recommendations, including specific changes to the Films, Videos and Publications Classification Act. And if I draw all of that as a Venn diagram with the overlaps, I get a scribble. So my question, I guess, is whose job is it to track all of the complex interactions and interdependencies between all of these areas of work? And how do we coordinate all of this to synergize and achieve what we've been talking about over these 2 days, which is a better, safer, healthier, more inclusive internet and society?
A fundamentally important question, David. Nicola? Of course, NCPACs can have more conferences.
Yeah, my question doesn't intersect nicely with that at all, so you're going to hold two massive ideas
No, that's
in your
fine.
head at
Go
the
ahead.
same
Shoot.
time.
Yeah, we have a little bit of time.
The thing I wanted to talk about was we use the language of the free and open internet a lot. The Prime Minister said it yesterday. We talk about it a lot, and often that's used as an excuse to not do something. And I think Kara, you talked about the balkanization of the internet, and if we built different Twitters for different countries, we'd be balkanizing. But usually when we talk about that, we're talking about the free and open internet, the infrastructure that is built through multi-stakeholder processes. Twitter is not built through multi-stakeholder processes. It's a company who gets to decide who gets to contribute to shaping the company or not. So why can't we talk about building different solutions for different communities? If you go to cities around the world, they don't look exactly the same because they have been built and informed by the cultures that are living inside of them, and vice versa. Why are we pursuing a single solution for every person on Earth that is usually being imposed by white, Western, capitalist ideas?
Excellent
Cheers.
question. Kara, you want to take a crack at the second, and maybe the Kim and Nicole rather, the crack at the first. Maybe Kara goes first. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. That was a good question that I think would involve maybe another half hour of discussion, maybe a couple coffees or even a glass of wine. But I'll try. Basically, I think where we're coming from, where I'm thinking about when I say the open internet, I'm talking about data portability. I'm talking about interoperability. I'm talking about trying to create shared realities so that people don't all just sit in their silo and they're not part of the same conversations. They're not seeing the same information, that things are being censored in a way that would really see a decline in freedom of expression and a chilling kind of effect on speech. I agree that there's been times where we probably, by this I mean, tech companies have probably moved in a way that didn't always take everybody on the journey with us. But over the past 2 years, I would just flag that that has been at the forefront of our minds as we've been looking at product changes and policy development. Twitter is one of the very few companies that actually has public consultation periods for changes in our policies. You can go onto our blog, we tweet about it, we get media to write about it. But when we make changes, whether it's updates to our dehumanization legislation, introducing a synthetic and manipulated media policy, it changes even to our verification policy. All of this, we've had a public consultation period that we allow anybody to provide feedback, and then we report back what we found and what that feedback said and what decisions we made about our policy development that came about from that. Even recently, last week, our product team sent out a whole tweet thread about how we were looking at new user interfaces and trying to get people to provide feedback, especially from accessibility standpoints, as we're looking for more audio spaces, so maybe people that are hearing impaired, or a visual medium for people that are low vision or vision impaired. So we are trying to really accept and bring in and have this open area where all of our users, all people that would be looking at Twitter, can be able to help input and provide feedback into the changes that we make, and eventually the platform that they get to use. So I take that on board, but I would definitely say when we're looking at the open internet, having open, borderless kind of communication, I would say that that's an important thing to fight for, and it's something that the company is going to continue to push as we start to look at how to continue to evolve and change Twitter as a service and as a product.
Cara, that's a graceful dodge, man. Well done. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that it would also recommend Nicole. What's her name? Nicole? Nicola? Yeah. Sorry, what's your name? Nicola. My understanding of what something, a long thread, as they usually are, by Jack, around his vision of a decentralized new architecture that is akin to what his favorite subject du jour is, which is Bitcoin, recommends itself for further study, reflection, and critical review, because I think it kind of more directly addresses, or perhaps even recommends itself to kind of governments looking at it, because you're really talking about a fundamental change in not just Twitter, but the idea of how decentralized platforms like Twitter can emerge in the future. It is still a thought experiment, in as much as I know, but Twitter is one platform through its CEO that is articulating that vision as an alternative to the very own company that he is CEO of. So I think it's worth critical reflection and critical engagement. But the two of you, perhaps to wrap up these 2 days, addressing David's question, or not.
So I think David's question was, whose job is it to sort out the hot mess of different legislative proposals and policy proposals that are currently on the table? So answering this question, I will draw on many years of working in government and then the opportunity of moving out of it from time to time to reflect. So ministers can sort this out, and I think obviously the stuff that's in train at the moment, there's trains that just got to continue to get to the station, but there's a great opportunity with this thing that is being called the media review. It initially was touted years ago when folks were saying, oh gee, this Broadcasting Act, it's not very fair, only applies to traditional broadcasters. What about these social media guys? What about them? And it's been many years is, since that was posed as the question, and carefully to be a first principles look at how do New Zealanders operate in your information ecosystem, and which bits of law and regulation do you need, which ones are fit for purpose, where do you not need regulation, when do you need this community approach, and when do you need awareness raising. If they were gutsy enough to say we'll do that properly, that could sort that out. The tricky thing is ministers aren't incentivised to do that because of 3-year election cycles, and this would take longer than 3 years. Do you want to offer a...
I would also add that you're completely correct, but there's also a lot of work in train for that. There are a lot of working groups, there's a lot of planning, there's a lot of engagement with industry, engagement with the public already happening to try and sort of map out how this will look over the next couple of years as all these different things come into play. So there's definitely like a single source of truth, perhaps not in one place, but it's definitely there and coming together.
That's only a question that a Kiwi can pose to another Kiwi, and a Kiwi can hopefully answer. With that, we bring the session to a close, and also the conference to a close. I apologize for running slightly over the time. I know Jeremy has a wrap-up of the 2 days that he will very quickly present. We can stay on stage. I just wanted to thank Cara, who joins us across the Tasman, and the 2 wonderful speakers here in the room. Perhaps a warm round of applause for a fantastic finish. We can stay. Well, we can leave. Jeremy, you wanna? Yeah, you can just do your wrap up.
Apologies to those on Zoom. We had several questions we weren't able to get to. And I'll just do my wrap up from here, sitting down, since I have a few things written on my computer. It will take 5 minutes. I have 5 points. For me, this is like simultaneously drinking from a fire hydrant or a fire and building an airplane in flight. So I'll try to be brief. Coming from as a peace builder, a practitioner for over a decade in a variety of contexts, one of the things we talk about as peace builders is, and John Paul Lederach, one of our sort of theorists and practitioners, talks about complexity thinking and the posing of paradoxes. So when we deal with violent or highly conflicted situations, how do we address those when they seem to confront us with significant and challenging paradoxes or conundrums? And I think for us, this is one of the things we face. And we're really looking at how do we protect our digital, social, and place-based commons through both and thinking. So that's what I would like us to think about, the both and thinking rather than just the either or. So, and I use that language because it's come up. The language we use is important, from talking about hate speech to dangerous speech, moving from an Anglo-centric to a multilingual type of approach or communication pattern. So the first sort of theme that emerged, and I'm doing my best to capture this. I'm sure there will be things that I missed. One is that principles and moral commitments versus hate and dangerous speech. These things matter. So how do we challenge or translate individual moral commitments? And this was mentioned with Vijay in our first session. How do we translate these into collective moral centers of gravity that anchor corporate, institutional, governmental, and communal actions and interventions, not only in virtual spaces, but the associated physical spaces? So there has, and she noted, there's been a delay in making explicit or public these internal conversations on principles, values, which are needed in the development of effective, sustainable, and meaningful frameworks and partnerships. So what does having those multiple transparencies about values and other issues, what does that look like? That's my first critical question. The second is, and this is actually has 2 parts, really has to do with this idea of the commons that has come up. And the both and is the social context and social cohesions that we are discussing versus the polarizations and the othering. And so how do we develop larger social cohesions and in the social and cultural context, offline, and which drive the online interactions and content. So we have global cross-cutting issues, treatment of women, indigenous youth, LGBTQ, and other minority communities, which has produced undercommons, or these ecosystems that we've been discussing. And so the critical question for me is, how do we bring these together at the same time, recognizing that having safe spaces online has actually been a positive for many people? That was part A. The second part is, and it leads right into it, how do we bridge the private and public commons? What does intervention in private spaces or networks that are inaccessible, is that needed? Is it desirable? And how do we cultivate a movement of people active in their private networks? And I think that, I can't remember who said that, because that was a quote from one of our speakers. How do we develop these social movements around social media, and how do we nurture those sets of practices, not just seminars, but how we assess and re-engage and retry these things to make our social media environments better? Okay.
Just stop lying stuff.
The second to last one here is, how do we deal with the push and pull of the conflict drivers within social media and the nonviolent resistance around it? So how do we restore trust in institutions, governments, corporations, the scientists, the journalists? Everyone thinks they can become one when social media gives them a platform. How do we understand the push and the pull, the attraction of polarization that pulls people down a rabbit hole versus the pull of social cohesion and truth? What are the models and best practices that make truth work in this space?
Jeremy, we are losing people, sorry.
Yep. How do we make truth not only attractive but workable? And lastly, just taking from a public health model, we're looking at both the acute system and the tertiary, or the dealing with acute systemic issues, as well as the deep-seated underlying root causes, particularly these historic harms, injustices that are now playing out in the social media universe. How do we address both the acute and the systemic? So I just want to end with that, and appreciate everyone's participation, input, and involvement. And I'll turn it over to Sanjana. Do we have any last words?
No last word. Well, no last words at all. Thank you very much for your participation as people are leaving to catch their flight. Thank you for coming down to Dunedin. Thank you for spending the 2 days here. Thank you for all of you from Zoom. We understand that there have been over 100 of you yesterday, and maybe about that number today. Wherever you are, wherever you joined in from whatever time zone and whatever country, thank you for the very active participation. Thank you for our speakers who come in from Zoom for being so wonderful and giving the team here no problem whatsoever to connect with you. And for everybody in the room who's going back to wherever you came from, whether it is here in Dunedin or further afield, safe travels, and let's carry on the conversation on whatever platform that we choose. That is not stipulated or prescriptive. But please keep in touch. Thank you so much for coming and spending 2 days. Bye.